Long before history was written in ink, it was carved into stone and sung by the wind that swept across the Iberian hills. The origins of the Iberians reach back thousands of years, to a time when Europe was young, a land of tribes, spirits, and endless horizons. They were born from the meeting of worlds, the old native peoples who had lived upon this land since the age of stone, and the travelers from across the sea, Phoenicians, Greeks, and others whose sails gleamed white against the Mediterranean sun. These newcomers brought trade, art, and ideas. But the Iberians, they made it their own. They built their homes from earth and stone, high upon the ridges where the air was clean and the view stretched for miles. Each settlement was both sanctuary and stronghold, narrow streets winding through clusters of houses, their walls painted with ochre and lime. Around them stretched fields of grain, olive trees, and vineyards, tended by calloused hands that had known both war and harvest. To live in Iberia was to live close to the earth, to the pulse of the seasons, and to the will of unseen gods. In their temples, small, sacred enclosures marked with carved idols, the Iberians prayed for rain, for victory, for the safe return of those who sailed away. Their religion was a tapestry of old nature worship and new foreign influences. The bull, the sun, the mother goddess, all found their place within the Iberian heart. When night fell, fires burned bright upon the hills, and shadows danced upon the walls as priests whispered to the stars. But the Iberians were not a single people. From the Ebro River to the southern coasts, they were a mosaic of tribes, each with its own chieftains, customs, and dialects. Some were farmers and traders, others fierce warriors who carried long curved swords and painted their bodies before battle. Yet, despite their divisions, they shared a certain spirit, proud, pragmatic, and deeply tied to their land. To them, freedom was sacred. Down by the shores, life was different. There, the Iberians met the world. From across the sea came ships, slender, foreign, smelling of pitch and spice. The Phoenicians were the first to arrive, traders from the distant city of Tyre, who saw in Iberia not a mystery, but an opportunity. They brought with them fine pottery, dyes of purple, and trinkets of gold. In return, they took what Iberia had in abundance: silver, tin, and salt. The Iberians watched, learned, and traded, building their own ships to meet the demand of distant markets. Through this contact, their world began to change. They learned new crafts, how to shape metal with greater precision, how to write symbols upon clay, how to build with stone instead of mud. The Iberians did not simply copy. They transformed what they learned into something entirely their own. Their art grew intricate, stylized figures, geometric patterns, and sculptures that seemed to breathe with life. The most famous among them, the Lady of Elche, with her serene face and elaborate headdress, remains a silent witness to the grace and skill of her people. By the time the Greeks began to explore these coasts, the Iberians had already become masters of trade and diplomacy. They welcomed foreign merchants, but never surrendered their independence. Their cities sparkled in the sunlight, and their warriors stood watch on the cliffs, ever ready, ever proud. But the Mediterranean was a restless place, and new powers were rising beyond the horizon. To the south, in mighty Carthage, another people, the descendants of the Phoenicians, began to dream of empire. And when the ambitions of Carthage met the determination of Rome, the quiet hills of Iberia would soon tremble beneath the march of foreign armies. By the time the first Carthaginian ships appeared on the horizon, the Iberian coast was alive with trade and movement. The ports smelled of salt and olive oil, and the air was filled with the creak of wooden masts and the cries of merchants haggling in half a dozen tongues. The Iberians had grown used to this rhythm, the endless tide of goods, people, and ideas flowing in and out of their harbors. But these new arrivals from the south were different. They did not merely trade, they commanded. Carthage had risen from the ashes of Tyre, its mother city in Phoenicia. What began as a network of trading posts had become a powerful maritime empire stretching across North Africa, Sicily, and beyond. Its generals sought resources, its merchants sought profit, and its rulers sought control. The riches of Iberia, its silver, its fertile fields, its strong warriors, called to them like a siren's song. At first, the Iberians welcomed the Carthaginians. They came bearing gifts, fine weapons, glass beads, scarlet cloth, and exotic animals from Africa. Carthaginian traders spoke of partnership and prosperity, of shared ventures and mutual benefit. And indeed, for a time, both peoples flourished. Carthage established fortified settlements along the coast. Places like Gator, today's Cadiz, and Iberian silver began to flow through their ports to every corner of the Mediterranean. But beneath this surface of cooperation lay unease. The Carthaginians were not content to be guests. They intended to be masters. Their generals began hiring Iberian warriors to fight in distant wars, paying them in gold and promises. Some tribes, tempted by wealth and prestige, joined them eagerly. Others bristled at the arrogance of these foreign overlords. The Iberians were fiercely proud, loyal to their own chieftains and gods, and they did not bend easily to outside rule. Then came Hamilcar Barca, father of the legendary Hannibal. With cunning and determination, he sought to make Iberia the new heart of Carthage's empire. He did not arrive as a merchant, but as a conqueror, marching inland with armies and elephants, subduing tribe after tribe. To those who submitted, he offered alliance and trade. To those who resisted, he brought fire and sword. Villages were burned, chiefs slain, and the once peaceful hills of Iberia echoed with the clash of war. Yet even as Carthage tightened its grip, Iberian courage endured. Some tribes chose rebellion over surrender. In the rugged mountains and dense forests, guerrilla warriors struck from the shadows, quick, silent, vanishing like smoke. The Carthaginians soon learned that the Iberian land itself was an enemy. Its twisting valleys, its sudden rains, its stubborn, unyielding people. Still, Carthage prevailed. Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, built a grand new city, Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, which would become the jewel of the Iberian coast. Under Carthaginian rule, Iberia became both a fortress and a treasure house. Its mines poured out silver that financed wars across the Mediterranean, and its ports became staging grounds for expeditions and conquest. But power never goes unchallenged. To the north, Rome watched. The Republic's senators, ever wary of rivals, viewed Carthage's expansion into Iberia with suspicion. It was only a matter of time before this land of hills and harbors became the battlefield for a struggle that would decide the fate of the ancient world. The winds of destiny began to shift once more. Iberia, proud, divided, and rich, stood at the crossroads of empires. The Carthaginians thought they had conquered it. The Romans believed they could claim it. But neither truly understood the soul of the Iberian people, resilient, fierce, and bound to their land by something far older than empire. The winds that swept across the Iberian peninsula carried the scent of change, smoke, iron, and destiny. When the Punic Wars erupted between Rome and Carthage, Iberia was no longer a distant frontier. It had become the prize in a struggle between two of the greatest powers the ancient world had ever known. For the Iberians, who had already endured centuries of foreign influence, this new storm would test their spirit like never before. It began with the ambitions of a single man, Hannibal Barca, the son of Hamilcar, raised among Iberian hills and sworn to avenge his father's defeats. To him, Iberia was both home and weapon. He drew strength from its warriors, wealth from its mines, and faith from its soil. From the city of Carthago Nova, he assembled one of the most formidable armies in history, an army of Africans, Gauls, and Iberians united under his command. When he swore eternal hatred for Rome, it was upon Iberian ground that he made his oath. Hannibal's Iberian soldiers followed him across rivers, mountains, and time itself, from the valleys of Spain to the frozen passes of the Alps, and onto the plains of Italy. Many never returned. Their courage became legend, their names lost to the stones of faraway lands. And while Hannibal's victories shook the heart of Rome, the Iberian homeland was left exposed, its fields trampled, its cities torn between loyalty and rebellion. Rome, relentless as the tide, struck back. Roman legions landed on the Iberian coasts with an efficiency and discipline the tribes had never witnessed before. They built camps like cities, roads that carved through wilderness, and fortresses that seemed to rise overnight. Their banners gleamed red beneath the sun, and their soldiers moved with a precision that spoke of centuries of conquest. At first, many Iberian tribes resisted fiercely. The Lusitanians, the Turdetani, and others fought as they always had, swift, unpredictable, striking from forests and hills before vanishing into the earth. But Rome was patient. It understood the art of war and the power of divide and rule. One by one, the tribes were drawn into alliances or crushed beneath the Roman march. Still, the Iberian defiance refused to die. There were stories, whispered around campfires, of warriors who fought with the fury of the gods, of chieftains who chose death before surrender, of mothers who buried their weapons in secret, waiting for the day their children would rise again. The land itself seemed to mourn, as if the rivers and mountains carried the sorrow of a people who knew their world was slipping away. Rome's generals, among them the young and ambitious Scipio Africanus, understood that to conquer Iberia, they had to do more than defeat its armies. They had to win its soul. Scipio studied their customs, respected their courage, and offered peace where others had brought fire. Slowly, the tide began to turn. One by one, Iberian cities opened their gates, and the once proud warriors found themselves standing beneath Roman standards. When Carthage finally fell, Iberia was no longer a land of free tribes. It was a province, a jewel in Rome's crown, a bridge between Europe and the world beyond. Yet even as the eagle banners flew over their hills, the Iberian heart still beat beneath the stone. Their language, their art, their memories endured, like embers glowing beneath the ashes of empire. For Rome, Iberia was a conquest. For the Iberians, it was transformation, painful, profound, and eternal. The world they had known was gone, but from its fragments, something new was being born. The legions of Rome did not simply conquer lands, they remade them. Where Iberian fortresses once stood, Roman cities began to rise, shining with marble forums, public baths, and temples to unfamiliar gods. The sound of Latin filled the air, mixing with the native tongues like two rivers merging into one. Yet beneath the new order, the spirit of the Iberians still lingered, quiet, stubborn, unbroken. After the defeat of Carthage, Rome turned its gaze inward upon Iberia. The peninsula was divided into provinces, Hispania Superior and Hispania Ulterior, names that would echo through centuries. Governors arrived from distant Italy, bringing Roman law, taxation, and a vision of empire that reached even the remotest villages. Soldiers built roads that stitched the land together, from the rugged Pyrenees to the sunlit plains of the south. Each stone they laid was both a symbol of conquest and a bridge to the future. At first, Roman rule was fragile. Rebellions flared like brush fires. The most famous came from the western hills, the Lusitanian Revolt, led by a warrior whose name still burns in memory, Viriathus. He was a shepherd, a hunter, and a fighter, a man of the mountains who rose against the greatest army in the world. Under his command, small bands of Iberians harried the legions with speed and cunning, vanishing into the wilderness after every victory. For years, Viriathus defied Rome. His men struck from the shadows, ambushing convoys, destroying outposts, and turning the land itself into a weapon. The Romans, frustrated and humiliated, called him the terror of Hispania. But even legends are mortal. In the end, betrayal brought him down, murdered in his sleep by his own men, bribed by Roman gold. When the Senate heard of it, they gave a cold, cruel answer. Rome does not pay traitors. With Viriathus gone, resistance waned. The remaining tribes were pacified, their leaders absorbed into the Roman order, their young men recruited into the legions they once fought. Iberia, once a patchwork of fierce, independent peoples, became a cornerstone of the empire. Yet in that submission lay a strange rebirth. Rome brought roads, aqueducts, and written law, but it also brought opportunity. Iberian craftsmen became Roman citizens, their art and architecture blending local traditions with imperial style. The once remote villages grew into towns with forums and theaters. Olive oil, wine, and silver flowed through Roman markets. Latin replaced old dialects, but echoes of the Iberian tongue whispered through it still, shaping the languages that would one day become Spanish and Portuguese. And though their gods were renamed, the Iberians did not forget their roots. They built Roman temples to Jupiter and Mars, but still left offerings to the spirits of their ancestors beneath sacred oaks and hidden springs. Their warriors joined Rome's armies, fighting in distant lands, from Gaul to Britannia, carrying with them the fierce pride of their homeland. In time, the Iberians and the Romans became indistinguishable. The conquerors had absorbed the conquered, but the conquered had also changed the conquerors. A new identity was forming, not purely Roman, not purely native, but something in between. Iberia, now Hispania, was no longer a frontier. It was Rome's beating heart in the west, rich, loyal, and alive. Yet empires, like tides, rise and recede. As centuries passed and Rome's strength began to wane, new storms gathered beyond its borders. The roads cracked, the legions thinned, and the world once again began to shift. And in the quiet hills of Hispania, the ancient Iberian spirit, buried but never dead, waited for its time to return. The marble cities of Rome's Iberia once gleamed beneath the sun, their baths steaming with scented oils, their amphitheaters echoing with laughter and blood. But time, the most patient conqueror of all, had begun its slow and silent march. The legions that once guarded the mountain passes were recalled to defend distant frontiers. The silver mines grew quiet. The aqueducts cracked under neglect. And in the whispers of the wind, the Iberian hills once again spoke in their old tongue. By the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was trembling. Waves of new peoples pressed upon its borders. Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, tribes from beyond the Rhine and Danube. They came seeking land, safety, and opportunity, but behind them moved the shadow of something far greater, the decline of Rome itself. The empire that had once united the known world was fracturing, piece by piece, like pottery dropped upon stone. In Hispania, the old Roman villas still stood, grand estates surrounded by olive groves and vineyards. But their masters grew fearful. Gold was hoarded, temples fell silent, and the great Roman roads filled with refugees. The north was no longer safe. Bands of Germanic warriors roamed freely, burning, looting, and settling as they pleased. In some places, the old provincial governors made fragile pacts with them, preferring tribute over destruction. Among the chaos, something remarkable happened. The Iberian spirit endured. The descendants of the old tribes, Celtiberians, Lusitanians, Turdetani, though now Romanized, remembered how to survive hardship. They retreated to the hills, to fortified towns, to hidden valleys where the ancient customs still lingered. When the Vandals crossed the Guadalquivir, when the Suebi claimed Galicia, and when the Visigoths marched south from Gaul, these mountain folk watched and waited, just as their ancestors had done. But deep within the Iberian heartland, among shepherds and fishermen, old beliefs still glowed like embers. They spoke of the freedom of the hills, the strength of the earth, the gods who never died. When a child was born, elders whispered blessings that had been spoken long before Caesar's time. The Iberian world had changed, yet its essence endured, invisible but indestructible, carried quietly through generations. The fall of Rome was not just a political collapse, it was a transformation. The villas crumbled, but the language survived, reshaped, softened, reborn as Romance tongues. Latin, once the speech of conquerors, became the voice of the people. The laws of Rome became the codes of kingdoms. The old roads, overgrown but unforgotten, still connected markets and monasteries. Out of ruin, a new world was being born, not Roman, not barbarian, but something entirely Iberian. And so, as the empire's light faded from the west, the land of the Iberians slipped into twilight. Not death, but dusk before a new dawn. The Visigoths would rule, the Moors would come, and kings would rise from the dust. Yet beneath every stone, beneath every field and chapel, the ancient heart of the Iberians still beat, quiet, patient, and eternal. When the dust of Rome's fall settled across Iberia, a new power emerged from the chaos. The Visigoths, a people once feared for their raids, now destined to rule. They had come as wanderers, following their king Alaric into Italy, sacking the Eternal City, and later crossing the Pyrenees to seek a land of their own. What they found in Hispania was not an empty ruin, but a land steeped in memory, a mosaic of Roman towns, Iberian villages, and Christian churches rising from the old pagan hills. The Visigoths were warriors, tall, fair-haired, their cloaks clasped with brooches of gold and garnet. Yet beneath their harsh exterior burned a strange reverence for order and faith. They were Arian Christians, followers of a creed that denied the full divinity of Christ, and this belief set them apart from the Latin-speaking population who clung to Catholicism. It was not just a difference of theology, it was a quiet struggle for the soul of Iberia itself. At first, the Visigothic kings ruled from Toulouse, their power stretching across both Gaul and Hispania. But when they were driven from France by the Franks, they made Toledo their new capital, a city that would soon become the beating heart of a Gothic Spain. From its stone walls and royal halls, they sought to blend two worlds, Gothic strength and Roman wisdom. They preserved Latin law, minted coins in the emperor's style, and adopted the Roman art of governance. Yet their Gothic blood made them proud, their hearts still drawn to the old tribal ways. The early Visigothic kings struggled to hold their fragile kingdom together. Rebellions flared, nobles plotted, and old Roman families still wielded influence behind cloistered doors. But through the turmoil, the land began to heal. Roads reopened, trade flickered back to life, and Christianity, both Arian and Catholic, spread through towns and countryside alike. Bishops became the new architects of order, their cathedrals the sanctuaries of a broken world. Then, in the year 589, a moment of profound change arrived. King Reccared I, seeking unity, stood before the bishops of the Third Council of Toledo and declared his conversion to Catholicism. His words carried across Iberia like a trumpet call. The ancient divide between Gothic and Roman faiths dissolved, and for the first time, the people of Hispania shared a single church. The Gothic kings were no longer foreign rulers. They became Christian monarchs, guardians of faith and law. Yet beneath the surface, shadows stirred. The Visigothic nobility grew restless, their loyalty often swayed by ambition. Succession was unstable. Kings were elected, overthrown, murdered. Assassins crept through palace corridors, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. Still, through the chaos, a vision of unity endured, an Iberian realm bound not by empire or tribe, but by faith. In monasteries scattered across the mountains, monks copied sacred texts by candlelight, preserving both Christian wisdom and fragments of the pagan past. Scholars in Toledo and Seville began to write once more. Men like Isidore of Seville, whose encyclopedic works would carry the knowledge of the ancient world into the Middle Ages. His dream was simple yet eternal, that learning, faith, and memory should never perish, even when kingdoms fall. For a moment, it seemed as if the Visigoths had succeeded where Rome had failed, creating a Christian Iberia united in purpose. But beyond the southern seas, new winds were rising, from deserts far to the east, where banners of green and gold fluttered in the hands of believers proclaiming a new faith. The echo of their prayers would soon reach Iberian shores, bringing with it both conquest and transformation. The age of the Visigoths was nearing its end. The age of Al-Andalus was about to begin. The year was 711 CE, a date whispered across centuries like a thunderclap in history. The once proud Visigothic kingdom had grown brittle with intrigue and corruption, its kings consumed by rivalry and distrust. In the south, near the shimmering waters of the Strait of Gibraltar, fate itself waited in the sails of a small invading force led by a man whose name would never be forgotten, Tariq ibn Ziyad. Across the sea he came, from the sun-scorched lands of North Africa, bringing with him a new faith, a new language, and a new world. His army was small, perhaps no more than 12,000 men, but their spirit was unbreakable. They carried banners of emerald and gold, and on their lips were words that would soon reshape Iberia forever. Allahu Akbar. God is great. The tale goes that when Tariq and his warriors reached the rocky coast, he gave an order that would seal their destiny. He commanded the burning of their ships. There would be no retreat, only victory or death. Standing before his men, he is said to have spoken words that still echo through time. Behind you is the sea, before you the enemy. You have left now only hope and courage. The battle that followed, the Battle of Guadalete, was swift and decisive. The Visigothic King Roderick, weighed down by betrayal within his own ranks, was defeated. His army crumbled beneath the desert-born warriors who fought not for gold, but for glory and faith. And so, with that single clash, the gates of Iberia were flung open. Like a tide sweeping through valleys and plains, the Moors, as the Christian chroniclers would later call them, advanced northward. Cities that had stood for centuries under Roman and Gothic banners fell one by one. Córdoba, Seville, Toledo, each became part of a new world, a realm unlike any the peninsula had ever seen. Within mere years, most of Iberia had come under Muslim rule. Only in the rugged mountains of the north did a few Christian enclaves survive, defiant and watchful. But this was not an age of simple conquest. The new rulers brought with them scholars, architects, poets, and traders, bearers of a civilization that shimmered with knowledge and art. They called their realm Al-Andalus, a name that would soon become a legend. Here, faith and intellect intertwined. Here, the desert's wisdom met the green valleys of the west. Under the crescent moon, cities began to bloom anew. The streets of Córdoba glowed with lamplight, and fountains whispered in marble courtyards. Libraries filled with scrolls from Greece, Persia, and India became sanctuaries of learning. The sound of prayer from minarets mingled with the rhythm of water and song. It was as if the land itself had awakened from a long slumber, breathing in a new dawn of beauty and reason. And yet, as always in Iberia, light and shadow walked hand in hand. For though Al-Andalus flourished, it was also a land of tension, of fragile coexistence between Muslim, Christian, and Jew. Some saw harmony, others saw only the edge of a blade. But for now, under the rule of the Umayyads, Iberia had entered an age of wonder. The people of the old Iberian blood, descendants of Celt, Roman, and Goth, did not vanish. They adapted, trading Latin for Arabic, and finding their place within the new order. In their eyes, the sun rose not for conquerors or kings, but for the enduring spirit of the land itself. The empire that had once belonged to Rome was gone. The Gothic crown had fallen to dust, and from that dust rose a new world, Al-Andalus, the jewel of the West, the mirror of the East. The centuries that followed the Moorish conquest of Iberia would give rise to one of the most dazzling civilizations the world has ever known, Al-Andalus, the radiant heart of medieval Europe. Under the crescent moon and the call of the muezzin, cities that had been scarred by war blossomed into gardens of light and wisdom. Córdoba became its crown jewel, a city of golden domes and shimmering marble, where art, science, and faith danced in harmony. By the 10th century, Córdoba was unlike anything in Christian Europe. While much of the continent slept in darkness after Rome's fall, Córdoba's streets were paved and lit by thousands of oil lamps. Its libraries held over 400,000 manuscripts, a treasure trove of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. Scholars from distant lands, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, gathered beneath its palm trees to debate the nature of the stars, the movements of the heavens, and the mysteries of the human soul. At the center of this brilliance stood the great mosque of Córdoba, its vast forest of arches glowing red and white beneath the lantern light. Each column whispered of distant worlds, marble from the Roman ruins, jasper from North Africa, porphyry from Egypt. When the faithful knelt within its endless rows, it was as though time itself bowed with them. The hum of prayer mingled with the scent of incense and orange blossoms, drifting through the courtyards where fountains murmured like ancient poetry. The rulers of Al-Andalus, first the Umayyad emirs, then the caliphs of Córdoba, ruled not with the iron hand of conquest, but with the elegance of culture. Under Abd al-Rahman III and his son Al-Hakam II, Al-Andalus reached its zenith. Córdoba became a beacon of learning, rivaling Baghdad, Cairo, and Constantinople. It was said that in its markets, one could find silks from Damascus, spices from India, ivory from Africa, and manuscripts from Athens, the whole world converging beneath Iberia's golden sun. But Al-Andalus was not only a place of trade and knowledge, it was also a sanctuary of spirit. The mystics of Sufism spoke of divine love that burned brighter than any earthly flame. Poets like Ibn Hazm wrote of passion and loss, of the beauty of life and the fleeting nature of time. In Granada, Seville, and Zaragoza, music and verse flowed through the palaces, their words carried on the evening wind. And yet, amid this harmony, the seeds of division began to take root. The unity of Al-Andalus, held together by wisdom and tolerance, would not last forever. The caliphate, too vast and too rich, began to fracture under its own brilliance. Ambition, jealousy, and faith would soon turn brother against brother. Still, in this age, for one luminous moment, Iberia became the meeting place of worlds. Christian monks from the north came to translate Arabic texts into Latin, bringing back with them the lost knowledge of Aristotle and Galen. From Al-Andalus flowed the sparks that would one day ignite Europe's Renaissance. The Iberian Peninsula had become a mirror, reflecting both the glory of the East and the promise of the West. And though this golden age could not last, its light would never truly fade. All golden ages must one day dim, and so it was with Al-Andalus. The same brilliance that made it the envy of the medieval world also made it fragile. By the early 11th century, the once mighty caliphate of Córdoba began to crack beneath the weight of ambition, faith, and fear. The unity that had bound Muslims, Christians, and Jews together in uneasy harmony began to unravel. When Al-Hakam II, the scholar caliph, died, his young son was too weak to hold the empire's reins. In the shadows of Córdoba's shimmering palaces, noble families and generals whispered of power. One man, the brilliant and ruthless Al-Mansur ibn Abi Amir, rose to prominence, ruling in the caliph's name but wielding absolute authority. Under his command, the armies of Al-Andalus marched north, burning Christian cities and striking deep into the heart of the peninsula. Even the sacred shrine of Santiago de Compostela was not spared. But when Al-Mansur died, his empire crumbled with him. The caliphate, once united from the Atlantic to the Pyrenees, splintered into dozens of small, rival kingdoms known as the taifas. Each taifa was ruled by its own emir or king, men of poetry and pride, who adorned their courts with fountains and gardens, but whose daggers were never far from reach. Córdoba, Seville, Granada, Toledo, Zaragoza, each became a kingdom unto itself, shining for a moment like a star before fading into the night. The taifas were magnificent and doomed. They competed not only in battle, but in beauty. Kings invited poets, architects, and philosophers to their courts, each striving to outshine the others. In Seville, palaces glittered with gold mosaics. In Zaragoza, astronomers charted the heavens. Yet behind the silks and splendor, the unity of Al-Andalus had been lost. When Christian armies from the north began to push southward, the taifas found themselves divided and vulnerable. Desperate to survive, some taifas paid tribute to the Christian kings, gold in exchange for peace. Others turned their eyes across the sea, calling for help from the Berber dynasties of North Africa. And so, new powers entered Iberia, fierce warriors from the deserts who would bring both salvation and subjugation. The Almoravids and later the Almohads crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, answering the call of their Muslim brothers, but soon ruling them with an iron fist. Under the Almoravids, discipline and orthodoxy returned to Al-Andalus. Under the Almohads, zeal and fire took hold. The palaces of the poets became citadels of faith, and the tolerant spirit of Cordoba's golden age began to fade. Yet even in this storm of conquest and reform, the light of knowledge did not die. From Averroes, the philosopher of Cordoba, to Maimonides, the Jewish scholar of wisdom, the thinkers of Al-Andalus continued to shape the world's understanding of science, reason, and God. Meanwhile, in the north, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal grew stronger. Their knights, driven by faith and ambition, dreamed of reclaiming the lands their ancestors had lost centuries before. The Reconquista, the great reconquest of Iberia, had begun. The time of the Taifas was one of both splendor and sorrow, a mosaic of shining city-states whose beauty still lingers in the arches of Seville, the stones of Toledo, and the legends of Granada. But their days were numbered. A new age of holy war, crusade, and destiny was rising. The story of Iberia was once again about to turn, from a land of scholars and poets to a battlefield where cross and crescent would clash for control of the soul of a continent. The age of peace had ended. In the north, where the mountains of Asturias touched the clouds, a small spark had survived the Moorish conquest. A handful of Christian warriors led, as legend tells, by a man named Pelayo. From this spark, a fire began to spread. The Moors had ruled Iberia for centuries, but now the tide was turning. The Christians called their struggle La Reconquista, the reconquest, a crusade not only of land, but of spirit. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. In the early years, the northern kingdoms were little more than scattered fortresses clinging to rocky hillsides. But with each generation, they grew stronger. The kingdoms of Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Castile, Aragon, and Portugal took shape, their kings and knights hardened by centuries of warfare. Each battle fought in the shadow of divine purpose, each victory seen as a sign that God's will favored the cross over the crescent. In these highlands, life was harsh, but faith was fierce. Monks carved prayers into cold stone, and warriors raised banners adorned with saints and swords. Tales of chivalry and sacrifice spread through the land, of martyrs who defied the Moors, of miracles that guided arrows and saved lives. The struggle was not just for soil or power, it was for identity. The Christian kingdoms believed they were reclaiming not only their homeland, but their very soul. As the centuries passed, the borders of Al-Andalus began to shrink. The unity that had once defined it was long gone, and the arrival of the Almoravids and Almohads from Africa had brought more discipline, but also more division. The Christians seized every opportunity. One by one, they captured cities that had once glowed under Muslim rule: Toledo in 1085, Zaragoza, Lisbon, Cordoba, and finally Seville. The battles were brutal. The crusading spirit that had swept through Europe found its echo in Iberia, where knights came from distant lands to fight beneath the blazing sun. But the Reconquista was not a single war. It was a saga of 1,000 battles, fought over nearly 8 centuries. And even amid the blood and ruin, life persisted. In many towns, Muslims, Christians, and Jews continued to live side by side, not as equals, but as survivors of a shared destiny. Amidst this turmoil rose the stories that would shape Iberian legend: tales of El Cid, the warrior of Castile, whose loyalty was as fierce as his sword, of kings who prayed before battle, and poets who mourned the passing of beauty amid war. The land itself became a poem, one written in blood, faith, and flame. By the 13th century, Christian banners flew over nearly all of Iberia. Only one Muslim kingdom remained, the jewel of Granada, nestled among the snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada. There, Under the Nasrid dynasty, the last echoes of Al-Andalus shimmered in defiance. The Alhambra Palace, with its carved arabesques and whispering fountains, stood as both a fortress and a farewell, the final breath of a civilization that had once lit the world. The Reconquista was nearing its end, but its price was heavy. For every victory, there was loss. For every city gained, 1,000 lives were taken. And yet, through centuries of war, Iberia's identity was reforged, no longer Moorish, nor Gothic, nor Roman, but something new. A land born of all that came before, scarred yet sacred, divided yet enduring. Soon, a final act would close this long epic, a marriage, a siege, and the fall of a kingdom that had once been paradise. The winter of 1491 was cruel, and the mountains of Granada lay draped in white silence. Yet below that quiet surface, destiny stirred. For nearly 8 centuries, Christians and Muslims had fought across the Iberian Peninsula, a struggle of faith, honor, and endurance that had defined generations. Now, at last, the end had come. The armies of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs, encircled the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, the glittering city of Granada. Granada was unlike any city in Christendom. Its towers gleamed red in the morning sun, its gardens overflowed with life, and its palaces whispered with poetry. From the Alhambra, the sultans of the Nasrid dynasty had ruled over the last vestige of Al-Andalus, a kingdom of scholars, artisans, and warriors who clung to their traditions as the Christian tide rose higher with every passing year. But the siege had drained them. Famine gnawed at the city, and the people prayed for miracles that would not come. Within the Alhambra's marble halls, Boabdil, the last sultan of Granada, walked in silence, his heart heavy with both duty and despair. He had inherited a kingdom crumbling under the weight of history, surrounded, outnumbered, and betrayed by fortune. On the plains below, the Christian camp shimmered with banners and crosses. Cannons thundered day and night, shaking the earth and breaking the walls that had once seemed eternal. And as the stars watched from above, the fate of a civilization hung by a thread. At dawn on January 2nd, 1492, the gates of Granada opened. Boabdil rode out with his retinue, carrying the keys of the city in his hands. Before him stood Ferdinand and Isabella, their armor shining, their faces solemn. The surrender was not marked by triumph, but by gravity. The Sultan dismounted, bowed his head, and handed over the keys, a gesture that symbolized not only the end of Muslim rule in Spain, but the closing of an age that had shaped the soul of Europe. Legend tells that as Boabdil departed, he paused on a ridge overlooking the city for the last time. His mother, the proud Aisha al-Hura, is said to have spoken the words that history would never forget. "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." The ridge became known as El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's sigh. From there, the last ruler of Al-Andalus looked upon the city that had once been paradise, now surrendered to history's tide. Granada's fall was not merely a military victory, it was a spiritual conquest. For the Catholic monarchs, it was the fulfillment of divine destiny, the unification of Spain under one faith and one crown. Across the Christian world, bells rang in celebration. Priests declared the Reconquista complete. But in the narrow streets of Granada, the air was thick with sorrow. The Muslim and Jewish communities that had once flourished under Andalusian skies now faced an uncertain future, one soon darkened by the Inquisition and forced conversions that would follow. Yet, even as one world died, another was being born. In that same year, 1492, a man named Christopher Columbus, supported by the very monarchs who had taken Granada, set sail westward across the unknown sea. Spain, newly united and burning with ambition, now turned its gaze from the mountains of Andalusia to the endless horizon of the Atlantic. The fall of Granada closed one chapter of Iberia's story, but opened another that would reach across the oceans and reshape the world. From the ruins of Al-Andalus, a new Spain emerged, proud, devout, and restless. Its knights and scholars would soon become conquerors and explorers, carrying their faith and flag far beyond the setting sun. And yet, somewhere in the cool courtyards of the Alhambra, beneath the whisper of fountains and the fading scent of orange blossoms, the memory of Al-Andalus lingered, a haunting echo of a time when Christians, Jews, and Muslims had shared a land, and the moon and cross had once. The year 1492 did not just mark the fall of Granada. It marked the rebirth of Iberia as the center of a new world. The fires of war that had burned across the peninsula for centuries were finally dimmed, and in their glow, a new flame was kindled, the flame of exploration. Spain and Portugal, two neighboring kingdoms once divided by rivalry and faith, now stood poised to shape the fate of the earth itself. What began as a quest for gold and glory would soon become a story of oceans crossed, continents discovered, and worlds forever changed. It was the Portuguese who first looked outward to sea. For generations, they had been honing their craft along the Atlantic, building swift caravels, mastering the compass, and learning the secrets of wind and current. Their princes were men of vision, none more so than Prince Henry the Navigator, whose school at Sagres became the crucible of maritime discovery. Under his guidance, Portuguese sailors ventured ever southward, mapping the coast of Africa, establishing trade with strange kingdoms, and seeking the fabled route to India. By the time Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached Calicut, India, the world had shifted. For the first time, a European nation had found a direct sea path to Asia, to its spices, silks, and wealth. Lisbon, once a quiet port, exploded into a hub of merchants and adventurers, its docks piled high with cinnamon, gold, and ivory. Portugal's empire was born not from conquest on land, but from courage on water, a web of outposts stretching from Goa to Macau, from Mozambique to Brazil. Yet even as the Portuguese carved their maritime path eastward, their neighbors to the west, the newly unified Spain, dreamed of a bolder gamble. In the court of Ferdinand and Isabella stood an Italian navigator, Christopher Columbus, who claimed the earth could be reached by sailing west. His idea was met with skepticism, even laughter, yet the Queen saw in him something more, a spark of destiny. With royal backing and divine faith, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera in August 1492, aboard 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. After weeks of terror, doubt, and silence across endless blue, a cry shattered the night. Tierra, land. On October 12th, Columbus set foot upon an island in the Bahamas, believing he had reached the edge of Asia. He could not have known that he had stumbled upon a continent unknown to his world, a land that would soon bear both wonder and tragedy. In the years that followed, Spanish conquistadors, men like Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and Hernando de Soto, sailed westward across the Atlantic with swords in hand and faith in their hearts. Driven by promises of wealth and the word of God, they toppled mighty empires like the Aztecs and the Incas, claiming vast territories for their distant king. From the jungles of the Amazon to the deserts of New Mexico, the cross of Spain was planted in foreign soil. The Iberian Peninsula, once a battleground of faiths, had now become the cradle of empires. Spain's dominion stretched from Europe to the Americas, while Portugal's banners flew across Africa and Asia. Their rivalry transformed the oceans into highways of conquest, commerce, and conversion. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the globe between them, an imaginary line through the Atlantic, where the Pope decreed that all lands to the west would belong to Spain and all to the east to Portugal. But this golden age came with shadows. The same ships that carried explorers also bore chains. The rise of Iberian empires marked the dawn of the Atlantic slave trade, the forced conversion of indigenous peoples, and the spread of diseases that would devastate entire civilizations. Gold from the New World flowed into Iberian ports, but so too did suffering. Still, in that brief, dazzling moment, Iberia stood at the heart of the world. Its ports glowed with lanterns that guided the course of destiny. Its kings ruled lands beyond imagination. Its sailors, scholars, and priests carried with them both the light of knowledge and the weight of empire. And in every voyage, every map drawn and coast named, there pulsed a heartbeat born of the same fire that had burned in the Reconquista, a belief that beyond the horizon, there was always more to discover. The dawn of the 16th century bathed Spain in gold and in illusion. From the docks of Seville, treasure fleets returned heavy with silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, their hulls groaning with riches torn from the heart of the New World. In the cathedrals of Madrid and Toledo, priests lifted chalices that glittered with Andean gold, offering prayers to a god who seemed to have blessed Spain with dominion over heaven and earth. Yet beneath the brilliance of this golden age, cracks were already forming, cracks that would one day swallow the empire whole. For now, however, Spain stood unrivaled. Its kings, Charles V and his son Philip II, ruled an empire on which the sun never set. Charles, born of the mighty Habsburg dynasty, inherited not just Spain but the vast realms of Austria, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire. He dreamed of a Christian world united under one crown, one church, one faith. From the snow-capped Alps to the steaming jungles of Peru, his banners flew proud and crimson. His armies marched with discipline, his fleets roamed with might, and his court overflowed with art, music, and wealth. But power, as always, came at a price. The empire's strength rested on the backs of others, on indigenous labor, African slaves, and colonial silver. The endless flow of bullion enriched Spain's nobility, but it also bred dependency. Gold, once a symbol of victory, became a poison. Inflation soared, industry withered, and peasants starved even as their rulers dined on imported luxury. Spain had conquered the world but lost its own foundation. In the New World, conquistadors transformed from explorers into governors. They carved out viceroyalties, New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and La Plata. Vast territories ruled in the name of the crown, but governed through greed and fear. Catholic missionaries followed in their wake, baptizing millions, erecting churches over temples, and replacing ancient gods with the cross. The Spanish Inquisition, already feared in Europe, extended its reach across the Atlantic, ensuring no soul escaped the grasp of faith. Meanwhile, back in Iberia, Philip II, the austere monarch of Escorial, sought to defend Catholicism against all threats, internal and foreign. His reign was one of grandeur and paranoia, of candlelit chapels and shadowed corridors where spies whispered in the dark. Under his command, Spain clashed with the Ottoman Empire at Lepanto, triumphed against Islamic fleets, and faced off with Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, whose resistance would drag Spain into decades of bloody war. Then came 1588, the year the world held its breath. The Spanish Armada, a fleet of over 100 ships, set sail to invade Protestant England, to crush heresy and restore Rome's glory. But storms and English fire ships turned the proud Armada into floating wrecks. It was a wound Spain would never fully heal from, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could falter before wind and will. Yet, in defeat, Spain's cultural soul burned brighter than ever. The 16th and early 17th centuries became the Siglo de Oro, the golden age of Spanish art and literature. Cervantes wrote of the mad knight Don Quixote, tilting at windmills that mirrored Spain's own fading dreams. Velázquez, El Greco, and Murillo painted saints and kings with divine melancholy, while the haunting strains of Spanish guitar echoed through moonlit courtyards. It was as though the empire, sensing its mortality, sought immortality through beauty. But even as art flourished, the empire's pulse weakened. Wars bled the treasury dry. Silver shipments were lost to pirates and storms. The Dutch declared independence, and England began its rise as a maritime rival. Across the Atlantic, whispers of rebellion stirred in colonial towns. The once unstoppable force that had united continents now strained under its own vastness. Still, in every port and monastery, in every painting and poem, one truth remained. The Iberians had reshaped the world. The spirit of the explorers, born from windswept coasts and restless hearts, continued to ripple across oceans and centuries. The golden light of Spain's empire was beginning to dim, but its reflection lingered, glowing faintly across the seas it had once ruled, whispering tales of glory, faith, and ambition. While Spain's empire bathed in the golden glare of the Americas, its neighbor, Portugal, quietly ruled the oceans. From the docks of Lisbon, ships set sail like floating fortresses, their sails billowing with the scent of salt and destiny. They carried spices from India, gold from Africa, porcelain from China, treasures that transformed the small Atlantic kingdom into a maritime titan. For a brief, dazzling moment in the 16th century, Portugal was the pulse of the world. Everywhere, the cross of Christ and the armillary sphere, the symbol of Portugal, appeared side by side. It was a sign of both faith and science, of prayer and precision. The Portuguese did not conquer empires like Spain, they connected them. Through their chain of fortified outposts, from Goa to Malacca, Mombasa to Macau, they created the first truly global trading network. They were merchants, sailors, and navigators before they were conquerors. At the heart of this maritime web was Lisbon, a city transformed almost overnight. Its narrow medieval streets filled with languages from across the world: Arabic, Tamil, Swahili, Cantonese. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, pepper, and sandalwood. Exotic animals, parrots, elephants, even tigers, were paraded through the royal gardens as living trophies of empire. The Portuguese kings, once lords of a small coastal realm, now styled themselves as lords of the navigation, conquest, and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. But behind the glitter of gold and silk, danger loomed. The very success that elevated Portugal also stretched it thin. Its empire was a chain of pearls scattered across the seas. Beautiful, yes, but fragile. Each fort depended on long supply lines, vulnerable to pirates, rival powers, and storms. Maintaining it required not just courage but constant vigilance. One man embodied both Portugal's glory and its tragedy. King Sebastian I, young, devout, and driven by visions of crusader glory, Sebastian dreamed of expanding Portugal's dominion into North Africa. Against the advice of his elders, he led an army across the sea in 1578 to battle the Moors in Morocco at the disastrous Battle of Alcácer Quibir. There, under the scorching desert sun, the Portuguese army was annihilated. Sebastian vanished, some said killed, others whispered he would return, like a sleeping king destined to save his people. His death plunged Portugal into chaos. With no heir, the throne passed to Spain's Philip II, uniting the Iberian crowns in the Iberian Union, 1580 to 1640. For 60 years, Portugal's empire became an extension of Spain's. Its ships seized by England and the Dutch, its colonies attacked, its people restless. The once proud navigators of the world found themselves bound under foreign rule. Yet, even in subjugation, the Portuguese spirit endured. In distant colonies, governors and merchants continued their work, often acting independently. Goa remained a jewel of the East, where European and Indian cultures mingled under palm trees and cathedral spires. Macau, perched on the edge of China, thrived as a gateway between East and West, its cobbled streets filled with Jesuits, traders, and dreamers. Then, in 1640, as Spain faltered under the weight of rebellion and war, Portugal rose again. A coup in Lisbon restored the native house of Braganza to the throne, ending 6 decades of Spanish control. Bells rang across the land, and sailors wept in their ships. Portugal was free once more. But the world had changed. The Dutch now ruled the spice trade, and England was rising as a maritime rival. Portugal's empire survived, but it would never again be the unchallenged force it once was. Still, the Portuguese had done what no one before them had imagined possible. They had mapped the unknown, bridged continents, and stitched the world together through trade, language, and faith. Their explorers, Vasco da Gama, Bartolomé Dias, Ferdinand Magellan, were not just men of the sea. They were architects of the modern world. And though their golden age was fading, its legacy endured in the language spoken across Brazil, in the spices that transformed European kitchens, in the maps that redrew the edges of the earth. Portugal had been small in land, but vast in vision. As the winds shifted and the seas grew more crowded, the Iberian empires faced a new world, one of competition, decline, and reinvention. But before the fall, there was still one last chapter of glory to be told, a story of faith, art, and endurance in the face of empire's twilight. The 17th century crept upon Iberia like a slow sunset, radiant at first, then fading into a deep and haunting dusk. The seas that had once carried ships of gold and glory now whispered of loss. The ports of Lisbon and Seville, once the beating hearts of empire, grew quieter with each passing year. Warehouses stood half empty, docks littered with abandoned anchors, and the scent of salt and spice, once the perfume of victory, began to fade. The Iberian empires, so vast and fearless, were beginning to decay under the weight of their own grandeur. The signs were everywhere. Spain, still mighty in appearance, was hollow within. Its treasuries were drained by endless wars, in Flanders, in Italy, against the Ottomans, and in defense of its colonies. The gold that once poured in from the Americas now barely kept pace with the crown's debts. Peasants groaned under heavy taxes, and soldiers fought for wages that never came. The glory that had once adorned the name of Habsburg had become a burden too heavy to bear. In the halls of Madrid's Escorial Palace, King Philip IV sat beneath ceilings painted with angels and saints, yet even divine art could not hide the creeping rot. His court was filled with flatterers and schemers, his ministers more concerned with survival than strategy. Spain's once proud navy was reduced to skeleton fleets, its galleons lost to storms and pirates. And across the ocean, the vast territories of the New World were stirring, restless under the weight of neglect. Yet even as politics faltered, faith and art burned with desperate brilliance. Spain's golden age lingered, illuminated by the brushstrokes of Velázquez, the verses of Lope de Vega, and the mystic writings of Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross. In their words and paintings, one could feel a nation trying to understand its suffering, to find beauty in decline, holiness in decay. Theirs was a spiritual defiance, a belief that even as empires fall, the soul endures. Meanwhile, Portugal, newly freed from Spanish rule, faced its own reckoning. The restoration of independence in 1640 had reignited national pride, but also exposed the scars of decades under foreign control. The Dutch had seized Malacca, Ceylon, and much of Brazil's coast. The once unbroken chain of Portuguese outposts had snapped, leaving fragments scattered like pearls lost to the tide. Lisbon struggled to defend what remained. Angola, Mozambique, Goa, Macau, and the vast, untamed heart of Brazil. But even in adversity, the Portuguese spirit proved unyielding. They shifted their focus westward, nurturing Brazil into the cornerstone of their empire. There, deep in the jungles and highlands, new fortunes were found in sugar, coffee, and gold. The city of Salvador de Bahia glowed under tropical skies, its churches shimmering with gilded altars that reflected both faith and exploitation. Brazil became not only Portugal's salvation but its identity, a mirror of what the Iberians had always been: explorers, survivors, dreamers. In both kingdoms, faith became both comfort and chain. The Catholic Church, which had once united Iberia, now suffocated its innovation. The Inquisition continued its shadowed work, silencing free thought in the name of purity. Books were banned, philosophers exiled, ideas strangled before they could bloom. While Northern Europe surged forward with science and reason, Iberia clung to visions of divine destiny, unable to see that the age of conquest had given way to the age of knowledge. Yet, even as the political power of Iberia waned, its cultural and spiritual echoes spread farther than ever. Spanish became the language of half a continent. Portuguese flowed through the jungles of the Amazon and the coasts of Africa. The Iberians had sewn themselves into the very fabric of the world, through language, architecture, music, and faith. Cathedrals rose in Manila, crosses stood in Bahia, and the melancholic fado songs of Lisbon carried the same longing that echoed through Spanish ballads of lost glory. The Iberian empires were dying, but they were not gone. Their essence lingered in the rhythms of the lands they touched, in the faiths they carried, and in the dreams of those who still gazed westward to the sea. For though the age of sails was ending, the horizon remained, eternal, beckoning, and endless. As the sun set over Iberia, its last light shimmered not on golden treasure, but on the waves, the same waves that had once carried its people to the edge of the world. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Iberian world stood on a knife's edge between ruin and rebirth. The once glorious empires that had stitched the oceans together were now fraying at their seams. The proud fleets of Spain and Portugal, once masters of the seas, were shadows of their former selves, their sails tattered, their cannons silent. Yet, in the ashes of decline, something ancient and defiant stirred once again, a determination to survive. In Spain, the death of the childless Charles II in 1700 marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the end of an era. The last of the Habsburg kings, frail and haunted, left behind a realm exhausted by war and debt. His passing ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, as Europe's great powers circled like vultures, eager to claim the spoils of empire. For over a decade, battlefields from Flanders to Catalonia echoed with cannon fire. When the war finally ended in 1714, the Bourbon dynasty, of French origin, ascended the Spanish throne. The Bourbons brought reform and order to the fractured kingdom. Under kings like Philip V and Charles III, Spain sought to modernize, rebuilding its navy, reorganizing its colonies, and reviving trade. The empire that had once lived on faith alone began to breathe again through policy, law, and administration. Roads were paved, ports rebuilt, and education encouraged. Yet for all their efforts, the Bourbons could not revive the soul of a weary empire. The colonies had tasted autonomy. They had learned to rule themselves in the shadows of distant kings. Across the ocean, the Spanish Americas were changing. In Mexico, Peru, and Buenos Aires, local elites, the criollos, began to resent the control of bureaucrats sent from Madrid. Enlightenment ideas seeped through the cracks of censorship, carried by books, whispers, and returning students. Words like liberty and rights began to take root in lands once ruled by the sword and the cross. The same faith that had once justified conquest now wrestled with conscience. Meanwhile, Portugal, though smaller and poorer, clung to its empire with quiet determination. The Marquis of Pombal, one of the most brilliant and ruthless statesmen of his age, transformed the nation after the catastrophic Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which leveled the city and killed tens of thousands. Out of the rubble, Pombal rebuilt Lisbon into a model of Enlightenment rationality, straight boulevards, strong foundations, and a new sense of order. He curbed the power of the church, modernized the economy, and tightened control over Brazil. For a time, it seemed Portugal had found its second wind. But empires, like men, cannot outrun time. By the dawn of the 19th century, revolutions burned across the world. The American Revolution, then the French, and finally the Napoleonic Wars shook Europe to its core. Iberia, caught between ambition and exhaustion, was thrown into chaos. Napoleon's armies marched into Spain and Portugal, shattering centuries of royal power. The Spanish king was deposed, and the Portuguese royal family fled across the Atlantic, to Rio de Janeiro, of all places, where they ruled their empire from exile. The irony was staggering. The empire had become the homeland. For the first time in history, a European monarchy ruled from the New World. Under King João VI, Brazil flourished as the new heart of Portuguese power, its ports booming, its cities expanding, its people growing restless with newfound confidence. When the royal court finally returned to Lisbon after Napoleon's defeat, Brazil refused to be a colony again. In 1822, It declared independence under Dom Pedro I, the king's own son. Spain faced a similar reckoning. Between 1810 and 1825, nearly all its colonies in the Americas rose in revolt. From Simón Bolívar in the Andes to José de San Martín in Argentina, the cry for freedom echoed across continents. The Spanish Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, disintegrated in a generation. What remained was a wounded monarchy ruling a proud but broken nation. And yet, even in loss, Iberia endured. The fire of conquest had turned to the embers of reflection. Spain and Portugal, stripped of empire, began to rediscover themselves, not as conquerors, but as nations of art, music, and thought. The 19th century brought pain, yes, but also rebirth. Romantic poets sang of lost glory and eternal sea winds. Painters captured the soul of common people instead of kings. The old empires had fallen, but the spirit that once dared to cross the world refused to die. The Iberians, for all their triumphs and tragedies, had carved their mark upon the earth, not just in conquest, but in culture, language, and identity. The seas they once ruled still whispered their name, and the lands they left behind still spoke their tongue. The age of empire was over, but the story of Iberia, of resilience, beauty, and memory, was far from finished. As the 19th century unfolded, the Iberian Peninsula stood at a crossroads, no longer the master of oceans, yet not content to fade quietly into history. The centuries of empire had left deep scars and deeper roots. In the wake of loss came reflection, and in reflection, rebirth. Spain and Portugal, once unified by conquest, now bound by endurance, began to rediscover who they were without crowns of gold and fleets of war. The sword had been set down, and in its place, the pen, the brush, and the song rose to define a new age. In Spain, the fall of empire brought not only political turmoil, but also artistic awakening. The land that had sent conquistadors across the sea now birthed poets, painters, and thinkers who explored new worlds of the mind. From the haunting realism of Francisco Goya, whose paintings captured the nightmares of war and tyranny, to the romantic fire of José de Espronceda and Gustavo Adolfo Becker, Spain's spirit turned inward, confronting both its darkness and its beauty. The 19th century was an era of revolution, and Spain, torn between monarchy, republic, and regionalism, reflected that struggle in its art and soul. Goya's The 3rd of May 1808, with its stark portrayal of execution and resistance, symbolized the agony of a nation trapped between oppression and rebellion. It was not merely art, it was a mirror of conscience. Later, movements like Modernismo and Generation of 98 questioned the meaning of Spain itself. Writers like Miguel de Unamuno and Pío Baroja wrestled with the question that haunted every Spaniard. What does it mean to be Spain when the empire is gone? Portugal, too, turned inward, but with a quiet melancholy that would come to define its cultural identity. The 19th century brought hardship, political instability, and loss, but it also gave birth to something uniquely Portuguese: saudade, that untranslatable emotion of longing, memory, and gentle sorrow. Out of this feeling rose the haunting fado music, echoing from the narrow streets of Lisbon's Alfama, sung by sailors, widows, and dreamers alike. The voice of Amalia Rodriguez would one day carry that feeling across the world, but its origins lay in this period, a people singing softly to remember what they had once been. The Portuguese poets of this age, Almeida Garrett, Antero de Quintal, and Fernando Pessoa in the next century, carried forward this introspection, blending national pride with existential wonder. Pessoa, especially, became the philosopher-poet of a Portugal between worlds. Through his many alter egos, he wrote of the sea, of fate, and of the dream of empire not as conquest, but as imagination. "My homeland," he wrote, "is the Portuguese language." In those few words, he transformed the legacy of empire into something eternal, not land or power, but words and soul. Politically, both nations grappled with modernization and reform. Liberal revolutions, constitutional monarchies, and civil wars reshaped Iberian life. The old nobility gave way to industrialists, intellectuals, and reformers. Railroads linked cities once divided by mountains. Universities became the new cathedrals of thought. Yet even as progress arrived, the ghosts of feudalism and empire lingered in the shadows. Poverty remained deep, and the countryside, from Andalusia's olive groves to Portugal's Alentejo plains, carried the weight of forgotten centuries. By the late 1800s, both Spain and Portugal stood on the edge of modernity, tired, yet alive with quiet resilience. In 1898, Spain faced its final humiliation when it lost its last colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, to the United States. It was called El Disaster, the disaster, and it sent the nation into existential crisis. Yet from this wound came a surge of creativity. The generation of 98 writers emerged, confronting decline not with despair, but with honesty. They called for renewal, for a Spain built on its people, not its empire. Portugal, too, shed the last remnants of monarchy in 1910, becoming a republic after centuries of royal rule. Though fragile and unstable, the new republic embodied the restless spirit of change sweeping across Europe. Lisbon's streets, once filled with royal processions, now echoed with protest songs and political debates. The age of kings was gone, and in its place rose the age of voices. Thus, Iberia entered the 20th century, no longer the world's conqueror, but its philosopher. The seas that had once carried its ships now carried its ideas, faith, doubt, art, longing. From Madrid to Lisbon, from Seville's flamenco halls to Porto's riverbanks, a quiet renaissance unfolded, one not of empire, but of essence. The Iberians had discovered something more enduring than conquest, the power of memory, language, and soul. The old world had died, but in its place, the Iberian heart beat on, proud, poetic, and eternal. The 20th century dawned on Iberia with both promise and peril, a fragile balance between the dreams of liberty and the ghosts of authoritarianism. For Spain and Portugal, nations shaped by centuries of monarchy, religion, and empire, modernity arrived not as a gentle evolution but as a storm. Beneath the surface of progress, the old fractures still ran deep, between city and countryside, faith and reason, privilege and poverty. What unfolded over the next 100 years would test the endurance of Iberian identity like never before, as both nations were plunged into decades of dictatorship, division, and ultimately, rebirth. In Spain, the early decades of the 20th century were a whirlwind of hope and chaos. The fall of the monarchy in 1931 gave birth to the Second Spanish Republic, a bold experiment in democracy, secularism, and reform. For the first time in centuries, Spain's future seemed to belong to its people, workers, women, and intellectuals who demanded education, land, and rights. Cities like Madrid and Barcelona became beacons of progress, alive with debate, art, and revolutionary zeal. Yet, this new freedom also deepened old divides. The church, the military, and the landed elite, pillars of traditional Spain, viewed the Republic as an assault on the nation's soul. Tension built like thunder over the Pyrenees. In 1936, the fragile Republic collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, and Spain descended into one of the most devastating conflicts in modern European history, the Spanish Civil War. It was not merely a battle between armies, but between visions of civilization, democracy versus authoritarianism, modernity versus tradition, hope versus fear. Villages were torn apart, families divided, and the land soaked in the blood of brother against brother. Poets like Federico Garcia Lorca captured the tragedy of a nation destroying itself, his words silenced by a bullet before the war's end. When the dust settled in 1939, the Republic was gone. In its place stood the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, whose rule would last for nearly 40 years. Spain became a land of silence, where censorship replaced debate and fear replaced freedom. Yet even under repression, the Spanish spirit endured. In secret gatherings, whispered poems, and the resilience of a people who refused to forget. Franco's regime sought to rebuild a Spain rooted in Catholicism and conservatism, cut off from the liberal currents of Europe. But history has a way of eroding even the strongest walls, and beneath the surface, the seeds of change slowly took root. Meanwhile, across the border, Portugal faced its own long night. In 1926, a military coup ended years of instability, paving the way for Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a scholar-turned-dictator who built the Estado Novo, the new state. Like Franco, Salazar ruled with iron discipline and traditionalist ideals, exalting order, faith, and obedience above all else. Under his regime, Portugal became isolated, poor, and silent, its people bound by fear, its colonies still clinging to a fading empire. Yet in Lisbon's backstreets, the quiet lament of fado music carried the voice of a nation longing for freedom. Both Iberian dictatorships endured far longer than the world expected. While Europe rose from the ashes of World War II, embracing democracy and prosperity, Spain and Portugal remained locked in time, relics of an age that refused to die. But even the longest shadows cannot withstand the dawn. In the 1960s and 70s, change began to stir once again. Student protests, labor strikes, and a restless younger generation demanded to breathe the air of modern Europe. In Portugal, the breaking point came in 1974 with the Carnation Revolution. It was one of the most peaceful revolutions in history. Soldiers placed red carnations in the barrels of their rifles as they marched through Lisbon, toppling the dictatorship without a single shot fired. Crowds poured into the streets, singing and weeping as freedom returned. The old colonial wars in Africa ended, and Portugal finally began to heal from centuries of imperial exhaustion. Spain's transformation came a year later, in 1975, when Franco died. The transition that followed, guided by King Juan Carlos I and reformers like Adolfo Suarez, was nothing short of miraculous. Through dialogue and compromise, Spain emerged from dictatorship into democracy without falling back into civil war. By 1978, a new constitution enshrined freedoms long denied: speech, assembly, and regional autonomy. The late 20th century saw both nations reclaim their place in the world. Spain and Portugal joined the European Union, transforming from rural, impoverished states into dynamic democracies. The wounds of the past began to fade, replaced by confidence, creativity, and modern identity. Cities once symbols of decline, Lisbon, Madrid, Barcelona, Porto, now pulsed with art, music, and possibility. Iberia, at last, had found peace not through empire or conquest, but through understanding itself. The Iberians had sailed the world, built empires, endured dictatorships, and survived collapse. And yet, through all the tides of history, they remained proud, poetic, unbroken. The story that began with ancient tribes and Phoenician traders had come full circle, reborn in democracy and light. The Iberian soul, tempered by centuries, now glowed with quiet strength, a testament to a people who had known both the weight of empire and the freedom of renewal. The story of Iberia does not end in the ruins of empires or the fall of dictatorships. It lives on, reborn in the quiet rhythm of everyday life, in the language, the music, and the landscape that still whisper the memory of its long, winding journey. The Iberian Peninsula, once a battleground of tribes and kingdoms, has become a bridge between Europe and Africa, past and present, the old world and the new. It is a place where stone fortresses stand beside glass towers, where the echoes of ancient chants blend with the hum of modern cities, and where every gust of sea wind carries the scent of history. The Iberians, the ancient people who first gave this land its name, may be gone, but their spirit endures. Their strength, their independence, their deep bond with the land. These qualities were passed down through every age. You can still see it in the farmers who till the terraced hillsides of Andalusia, in the fishermen who sail from the rocky coasts of Galicia, and in the artists who find beauty in struggle, just as their ancestors did when they carved gods from stone. From the Iberians came the Celts, the Romans, the Visigoths, and the Moors. From their fusion, Spain and Portugal were born. Empires rose and fell, faiths intertwined, and tongues evolved. Yet through it all, the peninsula never lost its character. Even today, its identity is a mosaic. Celtic hills in Galicia, Moorish arches in Granada, Roman bridges in Merida, Gothic cathedrals in Lisbon. The stones of Iberia tell a story written not by kings alone, but by countless hands, generations who built and rebuilt their world, each leaving a mark upon the soil. In the modern era, Iberia has learned the art of balance between tradition and progress, faith and freedom, memory and renewal. The scars of civil wars and colonial losses have not been erased, but transformed into lessons. Museums, universities, and storytellers now preserve what was once hidden or denied. The past is no longer. As centuries passed, the Iberians seemed to fade from the chronicles of history, their names swallowed by Latin, their cities rebranded with Roman titles, their gods renamed and absorbed into new pantheons. Yet beneath that veneer of conquest, the pulse of their world still lingered, quiet, steady, enduring. In the dry hills of Alicante and along the shores of Murcia, archaeologists still uncover fragments of their language etched into shards of pottery, bronze tablets, and tombstones. Each inscription is a whisper from the past, a voice speaking across 2,000 years, telling of warriors, traders, and craftsmen who once called this sunlit land their home. Their art still astonishes: smooth stone busts with almond eyes, delicate jewelry forged with Mediterranean skill, and painted ceramics that mirror the waves of the nearby sea. Though Rome claimed the land, it could never truly erase the soul of Iberia. Beneath every ruin, beneath every layer of empire, the Iberians endure, silent but unforgotten, the first storytellers of a peninsula that would one day shape empires, languages, and destinies across the world. Long before Rome, long before the maps of kings and kingdoms, the land of Iberia was already ancient. The air carried the scent of salt and dust, of wild thyme and olive groves clinging to rocky slopes. Across the eastern coastline, the early Iberians built their lives between mountains and sea, carving terraces into the hillsides, where the sun painted the earth in shades of gold and ochre. Small fortified settlements, known as oppida, rose upon cliffs and hilltops. From these vantage points, they watched the world, the winding rivers, the endless sea, and the faint silhouettes of foreign sails on the horizon. They were a people of contrasts, both fierce and refined, warriors and artisans, traders and mystics. Their world was filled with symbols, spirals carved into stone, bronze figures of warriors with tall crested helmets, and stylized animals that seemed to bridge the mortal and divine. Every shape, every pattern, held meaning, a reflection of their deep connection to the land and the forces that shaped it. The Iberians were not a single tribe, but many: the Contestani, the Bastitani, the Editani, and more, each with their own customs, dialects, and gods. Yet, bound together by trade, blood, and shared horizons, they formed a tapestry of culture stretching from the Ebro River to the mountains of Andalusia. In their towns, narrow streets wound between mud-brick homes, and central plazas buzzed with life. Farmers bartering olive oil for salt, smiths hammering iron in the glow of their forges, women spinning flax beside the doorways of their homes. The scent of baking bread mingled with the smoke of hearth fires, rising into the morning sky. From the coast, traders came: Phoenicians from Tyre, Greeks from Massalia, and later, Carthaginians. Their ships heavy with amphorae of wine, oil, and exotic goods. The Iberians welcomed them, for they were a people who understood the sea. They traded silver and iron from their mines, fine pottery, and even mercenary warriors, whose courage became renowned in the armies of foreign kings. But beneath their commerce and craftsmanship, the Iberians lived by a code of honor and kinship. To them, loyalty to the clan was sacred, and courage in battle was the truest measure of worth. Their burial sites reveal a people who revered their dead, warriors laid to rest with their weapons, horses, and ornaments, as though journeying into another realm. Fire played a central role in their funerary rites. Cremation was common, and the ashes of the departed were placed in urns, often adorned with painted symbols of protection and rebirth. To the Iberians, death was not an end but a transformation, a passage to join the ancestors who watched from the hills and stars. Even their language, now lost to time, carries traces of mystery. Written in curved, elegant symbols known as the Iberian script, it has only partially been deciphered. The surviving inscriptions, carved into stone stele and bronze plaques, speak in half-whispered names, lists of offerings, dedications to gods whose identities blur between human and celestial. To read them today is to glimpse fragments of a forgotten world, a people who stood at the crossroads of myth and history, shaping the spirit of the peninsula that would later bear their name. The Iberians lived not in isolation, but in motion. Their ships hugged the coastline. Their roads traced the rivers inland. Their stories moved with the wind, tales of warriors who never retreated, of queens who ruled from hilltop fortresses, of craftsmen whose hands turned raw earth into beauty. In every stone carving, every burial mound, and every artifact dug from the soil, their presence still lingers, like a song half-remembered but never truly gone. As the tides of time moved gently along the coasts of the Iberian Peninsula, new sails began to appear on the horizon, slender ships carved from cedar, their hulls painted with ochre, their prows shaped like the heads of birds and bulls. These were the Phoenicians, merchants of the eastern Mediterranean, who followed the rising and setting sun across endless waters. To the Iberians, their arrival seemed like a visitation from another world, a people who brought with them strange gods, new tools, and glittering goods from lands beyond imagining. The Iberians had long traded among themselves, but the Phoenicians opened a door to an entire sea of possibilities. They came first seeking metals, silver, tin, and copper, and the Iberians had plenty. From the mines of Sierra Morena and the hills near modern-day Huelva, streams of ore were drawn from the earth and melted in clay furnaces that glowed red against the night. The Phoenicians traded glass beads, fine textiles dyed in the royal purple of Tyre, and delicate ornaments of gold for Iberian ingots and handcrafted ceramics. In time, trading stations grew into bustling coastal towns, Gator, Malacca, Abdera, places where Iberian and Phoenician alike lived side by side, where languages mixed and new customs took root. From these harbors, knowledge flowed inland like a tide. The Iberians learned new techniques of metalworking and pottery. They saw writing used not only for ritual, but for record and trade. They watched ships being built with curved keels and double rows of oars. The Phoenicians brought not only goods, but stories. Of mighty Baal, the storm god, of Melkart, the protector of sailors, and of Astarte, the goddess of love and war. The Iberians, who already worshipped local deities tied to earth and sky, began to weave these foreign gods into their own pantheon, blending mythologies in a quiet act of cultural alchemy. Soon after came another wave of visitors, the Greeks. Their ships bore not the purple sails of Tyre, but white canvas emblazoned with symbols of their city-states. They founded colonies like Emporion and rode along the Catalonian coast, bringing amphorae of wine, olive oil, and beautifully painted pottery. Where the Phoenicians traded in secrecy and ritual, the Greeks brought open markets, debate, and artistry. To Iberian artisans, Greek forms, the curve of a kylix cup, the balanced proportions of a sculpture, were revelations. The Iberian smiths began crafting bronze figurines that mirrored the grace of Hellenic statues, yet kept the fierce spirit of their own people. The Greeks and Phoenicians did not conquer, they seduced. They reshaped Iberian life through exchange, not through empire. Local chiefs grew wealthy on trade. Merchants became intermediaries between inland tribes and the coast. Written contracts, minted coins, and foreign architecture began to appear. Yet through all this, the Iberians remained themselves. Their villages clung to their native laws, their warriors still carried curved falcata swords, their people still gathered in stone-walled sanctuaries to make offerings of animals and wine. The outer world might change, but the inner soul of Iberia endured. At night, the ports of Gator glowed with hundreds of oil lamps, reflecting upon the water like constellations fallen from the heavens. Iberian sailors listened to Phoenician songs about distant Sidon, while their children played beside amphorae filled with olive oil and honey. Out beyond the breakwaters, dolphins swam alongside the merchant ships, and the wind carried the mingled scents of cedarwood and tar. In those moments, the Iberians understood something new, that their world was no longer isolated. They were part of a greater rhythm, the heartbeat of the Mediterranean itself. And so, under the twin lights of foreign stars and Iberian fires, a new identity began to take shape, neither fully native nor entirely foreign. It was the beginning of a story that would bind Iberia to the fates of empires yet unborn, to Carthage, to Rome, and to the restless tides of history that forever whisper upon its shores. By the time the Phoenicians' voices had faded into legend, their western colonies had birthed something far more formidable, a new power rising from the ashes of Tyre, a city called Carthage. Born on the coast of North Africa, it inherited the ships, gods, and cunning of its ancestors, but with a hunger that reached beyond trade. Carthage was not content with commerce alone. It sought dominion over the seas. And as its purple sails once again appeared on the Iberian horizon, the Iberians sensed that the visitors now arriving were not mere merchants, but masters. Carthage moved slowly, methodically. Its agents settled where Phoenicians once traded, Gator, Malacca, and beyond, but this time they brought armies. Iberian chieftains were approached with offers of gold and alliances, their loyalty bought with weapons, fine armor, and promises of shared power. Some accepted, seeing in Carthage a chance to strengthen their own rule. Others resisted, remembering the freedom of their ancestors and the sacred balance of their land. Yet Carthaginian influence spread like a tide, silent, patient, unstoppable. Fortresses were built near the coast, and mercenaries from Africa and Iberia alike trained under the banners of Carthage's generals. To Carthage, Iberia was a treasure chest of metals. Its hills were rich in silver, its rivers glimmered with copper and gold dust. Mines were dug deep into the earth, their tunnels echoing with the sound of hammers and the breath of laborers who toiled in darkness. From the ports, fleets of ships sailed back to Africa laden with ingots that would finance the ambitions of Carthaginian warlords. The Iberians, once independent traders, became part of a machine, their craft, their courage, and their land all feeding an empire across the sea. Yet even under Carthaginian rule, the Iberians did not lose their spirit. Their warriors, renowned for their skill with the curved falcata and their ferocity in battle, were recruited into Carthaginian armies. They fought not only for coin but for pride, their names carried in the ranks of mercenaries who would soon march against Rome itself. In this crucible of conquest, Iberian tribes began to unite in ways they never had before, bound by shared struggle and shifting loyalties. The most famous of these alliances would shape the destiny of the peninsula. When the Barcid family, led by Hamilcar and his sons, Hasdrubal and the legendary Hannibal, arrived in Iberia, they did not come as mere conquerors. They came as rulers, empire builders, visionaries. Hamilcar saw Iberia not as a colony, but as a second homeland for Carthage, a foundation for its revenge against Rome after the First Punic War. He marched inland, founding new cities, forging pacts with Iberian tribes, and building a power base that would one day challenge the might of the Mediterranean's greatest republic. Under the Barcids, Iberia flourished in strange, uneasy prosperity. Roads were built, trade thrived, and Iberian and Carthaginian blood mixed in every market and battlefield. Hasdrubal founded the great city of Carthago Nova, New Carthage, a gleaming port of marble and bronze that became the heart of Carthaginian Iberia. From its walls, The empire watched both the sea and the mountains, wary of Rome's eyes across the horizon. But beneath this new order, tension smoldered. Some Iberian tribes welcomed Carthage's protection, others despised its foreign yoke. They remembered the freedom of their ancestors, the councils, the sacred groves, the right to rule their own lands. To them, Carthage was no ally but an invader cloaked in diplomacy. And as the young general Hannibal took command, that resentment would soon be tested in fire. For the Iberian Peninsula was about to become the stage. The sun rose over Iberia, gilding the mountain ridges and glinting off the armor of warriors gathered beneath new banners. At their head stood a man whose name would become immortal, Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, heir to Carthage's vengeance. He was young, sharp-eyed, and burdened with destiny. To the Iberians who fought beside him, he was not a foreign conqueror but a brother in arms, a leader who shared their hardship, who ate their bread, who spoke to them not as slaves but as soldiers of a shared purpose. They saw in him the fire of their own spirit, the defiance of the free against the mighty. From the moment Hannibal assumed command in Iberia, the land began to stir. He strengthened alliances with tribes long weary of Carthage's control, offering them gold, spoils, and respect. His charisma was a weapon as potent as his sword. The Celtiberians, Lusitanians, and proud Tartessians, once rivals, sometimes enemies, now marched together under the promise of glory and revenge. Hannibal knew that to strike Rome, he would need not just armies, but loyalty, and Iberia gave him both. The training grounds of Carthago Nova rang with the clang of metal and the rhythmic thunder of hooves. Iberian cavalrymen, famed across the known world for their speed and precision, honed their skills beside African war elephants imported from across the sea. The air smelled of salt and sweat, of leather and burning oil. Every campfire glowed with anticipation, for Hannibal's plan was not merely bold, it was impossible. He would march his army, men, horses, and elephants, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the frozen Alps into the very heart of Italy. No general before him had dared such madness. Yet for Hannibal, it was not madness, it was destiny. The Iberians followed him willingly, their falcatas gleaming in the dawn light. To them, Rome was an enemy unknown, but their loyalty to Hannibal was unshakable. They sang songs of war as they crossed the mountain passes. As the war raged across the Italian fields, Iberia itself became a battlefield of empires. Rome, alarmed by Hannibal's brilliance, sent armies across the sea to strike at his homeland and his base of power. Iberian tribes were torn. Some remained loyal to Carthage, others turned to Rome, seeking advantage in the shifting tides. Villages were razed, alliances shattered, and the once golden coastlines of Iberia echoed with the clash of legions and mercenaries. The land that had birthed Hannibal's dream was now paying the price for it. For years, the war raged without mercy. Iberian blood was spilled not only in Italy, but upon their own soil. Roman generals, including the Scipio family, advanced through the peninsula, capturing city after city, turning allies into subjects. Slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. Hannibal's victories in Italy, at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, became the stuff of legend, but without reinforcements from Iberia, his cause began to crumble. And so, as Rome's legions closed their grip on the peninsula, Iberian resistance grew desperate. In the hills and forests, bands of Iberian fighters waged guerrilla war against both sides, neither Roman nor Carthaginian, but loyal only to their own land. Their raids became ghost stories told among soldiers, who whispered that Iberia's mountains themselves had come alive to strike invaders in the dark. Yet even their courage could not stop the inevitable. One by one, the great cities of the coast fell to Rome's relentless advance. By the time Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his homeland, it was too late. The dream of Carthaginian Iberia had ended where it began, on its own soil, beneath its own stars. But in the ashes of conquest, something profound endured. The memory of the Iberians who had followed Hannibal into legend, and the land that had shaped both his rise and his ruin. The winds that once carried Carthaginian ships to Iberia now turned against them. From the south, the Mediterranean glistened like a blade, and upon its horizon, new sails appeared, white, disciplined, Roman. Their prows bore the eagle of the Republic, their legions the weight of centuries. To Rome, Iberia was no longer just a battlefield. It was the key to crushing Carthage forever. And so, as Hannibal fought for survival across the plains of Italy, another war unfolded across his homeland. A quiet, methodical storm led by Rome's most cunning general, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio was young, perhaps no older than Hannibal had been when he first came to Iberia. But he was driven by a fire that matched the Carthaginians' own, not of vengeance, but of destiny. He landed his forces near the shining city of Carthago Nova, the jewel of Iberia, the nerve center of Carthage's western dominion. Its harbors were crowded with ships, its walls glistened with bronze, and its markets overflowed with the wealth of two continents. The Iberians who lived within its shadow watched anxiously as the Roman legions approached, their formation precise, their banners fluttering in the salt wind. They had seen wars before, but never a war like this. The siege began with thunder. Roman catapults hurled flaming stones against the walls. The defenders answered with arrows and boiling oil. The air trembled with the cries of the wounded, the clash of metal, the roar of the sea against the rocks. For days, the battle raged without pause. Then, one morning, as the tide receded, Scipio saw his chance. The harbor's lagoon, normally too deep for crossing, had been pulled back by the moon's strange pull. The Romans advanced through the shallows, shields raised, wading knee-deep in the sea as arrows rained down. Before the defenders could regroup, the eagles were upon the walls. Carthago Nova fell in a single, breathtaking strike, the heart of Iberian Carthage torn open in a day. The aftermath was silence. Smoke curled from the temples, gold and silver flowed like rivers into Roman hands, and the city's people were led away in chains. Scipio stood upon its citadel and looked inland, to the mountains, the plains, and the countless tribes who still fought for freedom. Iberia, he realized, was not yet conquered. It would not bow easily, for its spirit was as old as the land itself. In the years that followed, the Iberians resisted with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. Every valley, every hilltop fortress became a stronghold of defiance. The Aravasi, Lusitani, and Celtiberi waged war not in open fields but from the wilderness, ambushing Roman patrols, vanishing into forests and caves, striking at night when the stars alone bore witness. The Romans, accustomed to orderly battles, found themselves facing ghosts. They won cities but lost peace. They built roads but found rebellion waiting at every turn. Iberia became a lesson in patience, an endless struggle that tested Rome's resolve and reshaped its armies. For the Iberians, the war was not about politics or empire. It was about survival, the preservation of their freedom, their gods, their identity. Mothers buried their jewelry in earthen jars to hide it from Roman tax collectors. Warriors swore oaths upon ancestral blades before vanishing into the hills. The land itself became an ally. The cliffs, the deserts, the river valleys all conspiring against foreign conquest. Rome may have taken their cities, but it could not so easily take their soul. Yet even the fiercest spirit cannot fight forever. Slowly, methodically, Rome tightened its grip. Fortresses became colonies. Latin words began to creep into the local speech. Roman coins jingled in Iberian markets. The old temples stood beside new shrines dedicated to Jupiter and Mars. And though the people still whispered prayers to their ancient gods, the sound of the Latin tongue grew louder with every generation. When Scipio finally sailed home, leaving behind his generals to complete the conquest, Iberia lay scarred but not broken. Its hills still echoed with rebellion. Its people still dreamed of freedom. But history, relentless as the tide, had begun to turn. A new empire now ruled the peninsula, an empire that would leave its mark for millennia. The wars had ended, but their echoes lingered like ghosts among the valleys and ruins of Iberia. The clang of swords was replaced by the rhythmic strike of hammers as Roman engineers began to build roads, aqueducts, forums, and walls of enduring stone. The eagles of Rome no longer marched in conquest, but presided over construction. The scars of war became foundations for new cities: Emerita Augusta, Tarraco, Corduba, and Caesar Augusta, names that shimmered with Latin pride and imperial glory. Yet beneath their orderly streets and marble facades, the heartbeat of the old Iberian world still throbbed, buried but alive. Rome did not simply conquer Iberia, it remade it. The landscape that had once been wild and tribal became a tapestry of civilization, connected by the long, straight veins of Roman roads. These highways stretched from the Atlantic shores to the Pyrenees, binding distant tribes into the pulse of empire. Soldiers became settlers, and legions became communities. Villas rose upon hilltops, adorned with mosaics that shimmered in the Iberian sun, depicting scenes of myth and conquest. The Romans brought laws, language, baths, and bureaucracy, but they also brought a strange kind of peace. A peace earned not by consent but by exhaustion, by the quiet surrender that follows generations of bloodshed. Still, the Iberians did not vanish. Their languages survived in whispers, their customs woven into the rhythm of Roman life. The festivals of the old gods were rebranded, their spirits hidden behind Latin names. The fierce independence that had once resisted empires now turned inward, manifesting in art, craftsmanship, and devotion to the land. A farmer plowing his field near the Guadalquivir might still offer a silent prayer to an ancient deity beneath his breath, even as he paid taxes to the Roman state. Identity became a dual inheritance, Roman on the surface, Iberian in the soul. Over the decades, Iberia became one of Rome's most vital provinces. Its mines glimmered with gold and silver, feeding the empire's economy. Its fields yielded olive oil, grain, and wine that sustained Rome's legions and citizens alike. The very wealth that had drawn conquerors for centuries now fueled the grandeur of the empire itself. Cities grew prosperous, theaters filled with laughter and applause, and Roman baths echoed with gossip and steam. Iberia was no longer a frontier, it was Rome itself, reborn in the West. But the transformation was not only material. It was spiritual. The Iberian youth grew up speaking Latin, serving in Roman legions, and dreaming not of tribal heroes, but of senators and Caesars. The very people whose ancestors had resisted Rome with spear and shield now marched beneath its standards, fighting wars in distant lands, Gaul, Britannia, and beyond. They became part of the machine that had once conquered them. History, as ever, had a cruel sense of irony. Yet beneath this veneer of Roman order, the old fires still burned. In the rugged mountains of the north, where the empire's reach thinned and the land grew wild, independent tribes still clung to their ancient ways. The Cantabri and Astures defied the legions in brutal mountain warfare, their resistance so fierce that it required the personal attention of Emperor Augustus himself. Even in victory, the Romans could not entirely extinguish their spirit. The hills of northern Iberia would remain, for centuries, a reminder that some souls cannot be conquered. Time, however, is the most patient conqueror of all. Generations passed, and the memory of rebellion faded into legend. Roman temples replaced Iberian sanctuaries. Latin poets sang of Iberian beauty and valor, folding the once foreign land into the grand narrative of empire. By the 1st century CE, the Iberians were no longer seen as outsiders, but as Romans, contributors to philosophy, art, and governance. The empire had done what no army alone could achieve. It had woven its identity into theirs. But in the quiet of dusk, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the fields turned to gold, one might still feel the ancient spirit of the land, the whisper of ancestors who once roamed free, the echo of forgotten gods, the faint pulse of an older rhythm beneath Rome's stone heart. For though empires rise and fall, the soul of a people, shaped by earth, sea, and memory, endures forever. For centuries, Iberia had been Rome's faithful jewel in the West, prosperous, peaceful, and proud. Its cities glittered with marble forums, amphitheaters echoed with cheers, and the scent of olive oil and wine drifted from its fertile plains to the distant capital. From Emerita to Hispalis, from Tarraco to Bracara Augusta, the rhythm of Roman life pulsed strong and steady. Latin was spoken in the marketplaces, senators governed from villas shaded by cypress and vine, and poets from Iberia were celebrated in Rome's grand libraries. Yet beneath this golden surface, cracks had begun to form, hairline fractures in the mighty edifice of empire. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow erosion of a statue by wind and rain. The frontiers grew restless, distant wars drained the treasury. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession, each more desperate than the last. The legions that once guarded the Pyrenees were drawn away to defend collapsing borders in Gaul and the Rhine. The proud roads that had bound the provinces together grew empty, and bandits, once unthinkable in Roman Iberia, began to haunt the hills again. Trade faltered, towns declined, and even the great villas of the elites began to crumble. The empire was still vast, but its heart was faltering. In the countryside, life grew simpler, rougher, more uncertain. Farmers, once part of Rome's grand economic web, turned inward, tending to their own lands, bartering with neighbors, and praying that the empire's troubles would not reach their doorsteps. The provincial governors, left without clear orders or support, became petty kings in all but name. In distant Rome, emperors dreamed of restoring order. In Iberia, people dreamed only of survival. The old roads still bore the marks of legionary sandals, but now they were overgrown with weeds and silence. Still, Iberia endured, as it always had. Its people were adaptable, shaped by centuries of conquest and change. When the first waves of Christianity washed ashore, carried by merchants, slaves, and missionaries, it found fertile ground among those weary of pagan promises. Slowly, temples to Jupiter and Mars fell silent, their altars repurposed for new faiths. The cross began to replace the eagle as the symbol of hope. By the time Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century, Iberia was already whispering the prayers of a new age. Churches rose beside ruined amphitheaters, and saints replaced heroes in the stories of the people. But faith could not save the empire from its own decay. The economy weakened, cities emptied, and even the mighty legions, once the pride of the Iberian provinces, became ghosts of their former selves. The great mines of gold and silver that had once enriched Rome now lay dormant, their workers gone or dead. As the 5th century dawned, word came from the north. The barbarians were coming. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans poured across the Rhine, flooding the weakened western provinces. They were not armies in the traditional sense, but whole nations on the move. Families, herds, warriors, and chieftains, driven by hunger, fear, and opportunity. When the frontiers finally broke, Iberia was left exposed. The legions were gone, the governors powerless, and the imperial will nothing more than a fading memory. Villages barred their doors, cities negotiated their survival, and ancient Roman forts became havens for refugees. The Vandals came first, burning and plundering their way across the peninsula before crossing into Africa. The Suebi carved out a kingdom in the northwest, ruling from the misty hills of Galaecia. And amid the chaos, the old Roman order collapsed, not with a single battle, but with a slow, weary sigh. Yet even in ruin, Iberia did not die. The stones of its Roman cities remained, weathered but unbroken. Its people, a mixture of Iberians, Romans, Celts, and countless others, endured with quiet resilience. They had seen empires rise and fall before, and they would again. Out of the ashes of Roman Iberia, new kingdoms would emerge, Visigothic, Islamic, Christian, each carrying forward a fragment of the land's ancient spirit. The roads might crumble, But the memory of civilization lingered in every ruined arch, every Latin inscription half buried in the soil. And as night fell upon the empire, the Iberian Peninsula stood between two worlds, the fading light of Rome behind it, and the unknown dawn of a new age before it. The fires of empire dimmed, but in the silence that followed, a whisper remained, a promise that the story of Iberia was far from over. When the dust of Rome's fall settled, the land that had once been Hispania stood divided, its cities scarred, its fields untended, its people unsure of the future. The Suebi ruled in the misty northwest, the Vandals had sailed away to Africa, and in the vacuum left behind, a new power emerged from the east, the Visigoths. Once enemies of Rome, these Germanic warriors had wandered across Europe in search of a home, carving their path through the wreckage of empires. Tall, fair-haired, and battle-hardened, they brought with them not only swords but also the dream of stability in a crumbling world. Led by their kings, first Athalf, then Waliah, and later Theodoric I, the Visigoths entered Iberia in the early 5th century. At first, they came as allies of Rome, sent to drive out other barbarian tribes. But as the empire withered away, the Visigoths stayed. By mid-century, they had established themselves as masters of most of the peninsula, ruling from their new capital at Toledo. There, amid the ruins of Roman grandeur, they built something new, a kingdom that sought to blend the strength of the Gothic warrior with the wisdom of the Roman world. The Visigoths were not mere conquerors, they were builders and adapters. They kept much of the Roman administrative system, used Latin in law and governance, and slowly adopted Christianity, though their version, Arianism, differed from the Roman Catholic faith. This religious divide created tension between the Gothic elites and the native Hispano-Roman population, who remained loyal to the Catholic Church. Yet over time, those differences began to fade. The two cultures, Roman and Gothic, intertwined, producing a hybrid society that was both ancient and new. In Toledo, narrow streets echoed with Latin prayers and Gothic chants. Bishops debated theology in candlelit halls, while Gothic nobles dined in marble courtyards that once belonged to Roman senators. The kingdom grew organized, sophisticated, and self-assured. The Visigothic kings sought legitimacy not through fear, but through law. One of the most remarkable achievements of this era was the Liber Iudiciarum, or Book of Judgments, a unified code of law that applied equally to Goths and Romans. It was a symbol of unity, an attempt to weave two peoples into one fabric. Yet unity was fragile. Behind the gilded walls of Toledo's palaces, intrigue simmered. Kings rose and fell with alarming regularity, often murdered by their rivals or betrayed by their own guards. The Visigothic court became a theater of ambition. Pious bishops, ambitious nobles, and jealous generals all vying for influence. Still, despite the chaos, the kingdom endured for nearly 3 centuries. Under rulers like Leovigild and his son Reccared, the Visigoths achieved their greatest triumph, the conversion to Catholicism in 589 CE. When Reccared declared his faith before the bishops of the Third Council of Toledo, it was more than a religious gesture. It was a declaration that Goth and Roman were now one people, bound by faith and destiny. The Visigothic kingdom became a beacon of learning and administration in post-Roman Europe. Its scholars preserved classical texts, its architects built elegant churches like San Juan de Baños, and its craftsmen created jewelry and manuscripts that gleamed with both Gothic and Roman artistry. Yet beneath the surface, storm clouds gathered once again. The monarchy, though powerful, was unstable, succession crises were frequent, and regional nobles often acted as independent rulers. Moreover, new forces were stirring beyond the Pyrenees and across the sea. In the early 8th century, as the world seemed momentarily calm, riders from the south appeared on the horizon, swift, disciplined, and driven by a new faith. They were the Muslims, and their arrival would change Iberia forever. The Visigoths, weakened by internal division and blind to the scale of the coming storm, were unprepared. In 711 CE, at the Battle of Guadalete, the last Visigothic king, Roderick, faced the invading forces of Tariq ibn Ziyad. The clash was fierce but brief. The Visigothic army shattered, their kingdom dissolved, and their legacy was swallowed by the tides of history. But even as the crescent moon rose over Iberia, the spirit of the land endured. The stones of Toledo, Merida, and Córdoba still whispered of older ages, of Iberians, Romans, and Goths. And deep in the northern mountains, among the mist and pine, a few Christian warriors fled the wreckage, vowing to reclaim their homeland one day. The age of the Visigoths had ended. The age of Al-Andalus was about to begin. The year was 711, and the sun rose over a land forever changed. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, under the banner of the Umayyad Caliphate, came a new tide, swift, determined, and radiant with faith. At its head rode Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander whose name would echo through centuries. His army was small but fierce, Arabs and Berbers bound together by the words of the Quran and the promise of victory. Legend says that upon landing, Tariq burned his ships, declaring to his men, "The sea is behind us and the enemy before us. There is no escape but in victory." Whether truth or myth, the moment became the spark that lit a new era. The Visigothic kingdom, already fragile and divided, fell with astonishing speed. At Guadalete, King Roderick was slain, his crown lost in the river's mud, and within a few years, the entire peninsula lay open before the conquerors. But what followed was not mere destruction, it was transformation. The Muslim conquerors, guided by both sword and scripture, brought with them a civilization unlike anything Iberia had ever seen. They called the land Al-Andalus, and under their rule, it would become a jewel of the medieval world. Cities that had lain dormant since Rome's decline awoke once more. Córdoba, once a quiet provincial town, grew into a dazzling metropolis of light and learning. Its skyline pierced by the grand arches of the great mosque, its streets paved and lit while the rest of Europe languished in darkness. Scholars from across the world flocked there, drawn by its libraries, its observatories, and its spirit of inquiry. Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew mingled in the air, and in the shade of orange trees, poets recited verses that celebrated both God and the beauty of the earth. In Al-Andalus, knowledge was sacred. Astronomers charted the heavens, physicians wrote treatises that would later guide European medicine, and philosophers translated the wisdom of Greece into Arabic and then back into Latin, preserving the classical world's spirit through the storm of the Dark Ages. It was here that Averroes would interpret Aristotle, Maimonides would blend faith and reason, and countless unnamed scribes would copy manuscripts by lamplight, saving the past for the future. But Al-Andalus was not only a realm of scholars. It was a place of art, architecture, and sensual beauty. The sound of lutes and flutes filled the courtyards of Granada. Water flowed through marble fountains, carrying cool air through tiled palaces where geometry and poetry met. The Alcazar of Seville, the Mosque of Córdoba, and later the Alhambra in Granada became living testaments to human imagination, where stone, light, and symmetry danced together in eternal harmony. For centuries, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived here in a fragile coexistence that the world would later call convivencia, coexistence. It was not always peaceful, but it was profoundly creative. Each culture influenced the other. Christian kings adopted Arabic science and Moorish architecture. Muslim poets wrote of love and loss with Latin rhythm. Jewish scholars became the translators of worlds. Iberia was no longer just a frontier of Europe. It was its intellectual heart. Yet, beneath the beauty, power shifted like sand. After the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, Al-Andalus became an independent emirate, and later a caliphate of Córdoba under Abd al-Rahman III, a golden age of unity and splendor. But even golden ages fade. Internal rivalries, religious divides, and the ambitions of warlords tore at the seams of the realm. By the 11th century, the great caliphate fractured into smaller kingdoms, the taifas, each ruled by its own prince, each shining and vulnerable like stars before dawn. And in the north, Far from the perfumed palaces and sunlit courtyards of Al-Andalus, another story was beginning to take shape, one whispered among mountain fortresses and monastery walls. There, small Christian kingdoms, Asturias, Navarre, and Leon, began to stir. Their leaders spoke of reclaiming what was lost, not for glory alone, but for faith. The Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim Iberia, had begun, a tide as slow and unstoppable as the one that had brought the Moors in the first place. But for now, as the lamps of Córdoba burned late into the night and the call to prayer echoed through olive groves, Al-Andalus stood as a beacon of civilization, a place where knowledge triumphed over ignorance, and beauty defied the darkness of the age. In the rugged peaks of northern Iberia, where mist clings to the pines and valleys echo with the sound of church bells, the flame of resistance flickered back to life. It began humbly, not with grand armies or royal proclamations, but with faith, memory, and survival. After the fall of the Visigoths, a few scattered nobles, monks, and warriors fled into these mountains, carrying with them fragments of their kingdom, relics, crosses, and the dream of restoration. They found refuge in the wild lands of Asturias, a place of deep forests and cold streams, where Roman roads had long crumbled into the earth. It was there, around the early 8th century, that a man named Pelayo, a minor Visigothic noble, rallied a small band of Christian warriors. They fought not for empire, but for freedom. In 722 CE, at the Battle of Covadonga, Pelayo and his men, hidden among the mountain cliffs, ambushed a Muslim force sent to suppress them. Against all odds, the Christians prevailed. It was a small battle, insignificant in the eyes of great empires, yet it marked the birth of a legend. To later generations, Covadonga would be remembered as the spark of the Reconquista, the long, relentless campaign to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. The early Christian kingdoms were fragile and isolated, clinging to life in the harsh northern lands. But they had something their enemies did not: time and faith. From Asturias rose Leon. From Navarre came new dynasties, and further east, in the Pyrenees, the seeds of Aragon and Catalonia began to take root. Slowly, these kingdoms expanded southward, reclaiming land valley by valley, fortress by fortress. The Reconquista was not a single war, but a rhythm: advance and retreat, alliance and betrayal, peace and battle, repeated across centuries. As the Christian frontiers grew, their cultures evolved. The early kings saw themselves not just as rulers, but as heirs to the lost Visigothic crown, defenders of Christendom, chosen by God to restore what had been broken. Monks chronicled their victories in illuminated manuscripts, blending myth and history until the two were inseparable. Every hilltop fortress became a symbol of divine perseverance. Every church built on the ruins of a mosque became a sign that faith had returned. But this was no simple clash of civilizations. The Christian and Muslim worlds in Iberia were deeply intertwined. Along the borders, known as the frontier marches, knights traded with Muslim merchants, scholars translated Arabic texts, and sometimes even shared loyalties shifted with politics rather than religion. There were Christian lords who spoke Arabic fluently and Muslim rulers who employed Christian mercenaries. Iberia, divided yet connected, was unlike any other land in medieval Europe. By the 11th century, the Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus began to weaken under internal strife. The Christian monarchs saw opportunity in their division. Powerful rulers like Fernando I of Leon and Sancho III of Navarre pushed deeper into the heart of the peninsula, demanding tribute, the parias, from Muslim princes. These payments of gold and silver filled Christian treasuries, funding cathedrals, castles, and armies. Religion remained the banner, but ambition and wealth drove the march as much as faith did. And then, from across the sea, another Muslim power arose: the Almoravids, warriors from North Africa who saw the decadence of the Andalusi princes as an affront to Islam. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar like a storm, uniting the Muslim lands once more under their strict rule. For a time, the tide of Christian expansion halted. Battles like Sagrajas reminded the northern kings that Al-Andalus still had the strength to fight back. But nothing could stop the slow turning of history. In the towns of Leon, Burgos, and Barcelona, the clang of blacksmiths forging swords echoed against the stone walls. Across the mountains, pilgrims walked the sacred road to Santiago de Compostela, where the bones of the Apostle James were said to rest, a holy journey that united Christians across Europe and gave moral strength to the Reconquista. Kings came and went, but the idea endured. One day, the cross would again shine over all Iberia. And as the centuries passed, that idea grew into destiny. The kingdoms of the north, once small, defiant enclaves in the mountains, would soon rise as great powers. Their knights would ride under banners embroidered with crosses, their monarchs would claim divine right, and their poets would sing of holy war and lost love. The Reconquista had begun as survival, but now it was becoming a crusade, a struggle not just for land, but for the soul of a continent. By the late 11th century, Iberia had become a chessboard of faiths and crowns, Christian kingdoms rising in the north, Muslim taifas glimmering in the south, and between them, 1,000 fragile alliances written in ink and broken in blood. War was constant, but so was cooperation. Gold and silk flowed north, steel and ambition flowed south. And amid this turbulent landscape emerged a man whose life would blur the line between history and myth, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known to the world as El Cid. Born near Burgos, Rodrigo was the very image of the medieval knight, proud, loyal, and fearless. Trained in the court of King Sancho II of Castile, he rose quickly through the ranks, earning fame for his skill in battle and his command of men. But when politics turned deadly and Sancho was assassinated, Rodrigo's loyalty became his curse. Banished by the new king, Alfonso VI, El Cid found himself cast out, a warrior without a master, a blade without a hand to wield it. Yet exile did not break him. It transformed him. Wandering across the torn lands of Iberia, El Cid sold his sword to whoever could pay, Christian or Muslim. In the age of holy war, this was both scandal and necessity. For El Cid, honor was not blind loyalty. It was survival through strength. He fought for Christian kings, then for Muslim emirs, and sometimes against both. His most famous alliance was with Moorish Zaragoza, where he served as commander of armies, defending Muslim lands with Christian steel. It was in this crucible of conflict that El Cid's legend was forged. Songs were sung of him, of how his enemies trembled when they saw his banner, of how his horse, Babieca, thundered through the dust of battle, and of how his sword, Tizona, shone with the reflection of both sun and blood. Chroniclers wrote that even after death, his body was strapped to his horse, leading one final charge that scattered the Moors, a myth so powerful that it outlived the centuries. In truth, El Cid's greatest triumph came not through sheer conquest, but through cunning and resilience. In 1094, he captured the city of Valencia, ruling it as an independent lord, not for Castile, not for Aragon, but for himself and his followers. In Valencia's palaces, Arabic calligraphy mingled with Christian symbols, and its markets buzzed with merchants from both worlds. It was a reflection of Iberia itself, divided yet intertwined, fierce yet fragile. El Cid ruled with fairness, his authority recognized even by his Muslim subjects. To some, he was a hero, to others, a usurper. To history, he became a legend. But while Rodrigo carved his destiny in the east, greater powers were stirring in the west. The Almoravids, zealous warriors from North Africa, crossed the sea once more to restore unity and faith to Al-Andalus. Under their black banners, they reclaimed much of what the Christian kings had taken. Valencia too would eventually fall after El Cid's death in 1099. Yet even in defeat, his story endured, passed from campfire to monastery, from poem to epic. The Canta de Mio Cid, the great Spanish epic, would immortalize him as the perfect knight, loyal to God, to honor, and to Spain. The Reconquista pressed on, its pace now quickened by faith and rivalry. The kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal began to take shape, each with its own dreams of glory. Castile, vast and ambitious, became the sword of Christendom. Aragon, strategic and cunning, turned toward the Mediterranean. Portugal, born on the western marches, gazed toward the sea. Their banners flew over captured fortresses, while the frontier between Christian and Muslim lands became ever more fluid, a place of trade, war, and cultural fusion. In monasteries and courts, chronicles declared each victory a sign of divine favor. In truth, it was not divine will alone that drove the Reconquista. It was human ambition, greed, courage, and tragedy woven together into a tapestry that spanned centuries. And so as the 12th century unfolded, the Iberian Peninsula entered an age of both golden triumph and brutal reckoning. The death of El Cid had not dimmed the spirit of the Reconquista, it had only sharpened it. Across the northern kingdoms, a new generation of monarchs emerged, more organized, more ambitious, and driven by a vision that stretched beyond mere survival. Iberia was no longer a land of wandering knights and fragile truces. It was becoming a theater of dynasties, crusades, and destiny. In Castile, the powerful Alfonso VII declared himself Imperator Totius Hispaniae, Emperor of all Spain, a bold claim that spoke as much to ambition as to reality. His realm, vast and restless, was built upon alliances with warrior nobles and religious orders, the Knights of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, who saw the Reconquista as both holy duty and path to land and power. Southward, the banners of Christendom advanced inch by inch, taking towns and fortresses from weary Muslim rulers who had long lost unity. Meanwhile, the Muslim world in Iberia faced a new tide of zeal from across the sea. The Almoravids, who once saved Al-Andalus from collapse, now faced their own decline, their strict piety and foreign rule alienating local lords and poets who still remembered the brilliance of Córdoba. Into that void rose the Almohads, fierce reformers from the Atlas Mountains, their faith as unyielding as their discipline. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with armies clad in white, proclaiming the unity of God and the restoration of true Islam. Their arrival reignited the flames of resistance, and for a moment, it seemed as though the tide might turn. The clash came at Alarcos in 1195. The Christian armies of Castile, proud and confident, met the Almohad host on the plains and were utterly crushed. It was a disaster that shook the kingdoms of the north to their core. Yet from defeat was born determination. For decades, Iberia prepared for a reckoning, its kings forging alliances that transcended their rivalries. Even the church intervened, calling upon the knights of Europe to join what it declared a crusade of Spain. Then, in 1212, came the day of destiny, Las Navas de Tolosa. High in the mountains of Andalusia, a coalition of Christian kings, Alfonso VIII of Castile, Sancho VII of Navarre, and Peter II of Aragon, gathered their armies beneath the blazing summer sun. Opposite them stood the might of the Almohad Caliphate, its banners stretching across the horizon, its faith unshakable. For hours, the two sides clashed in a storm of steel and dust. Arrows darkened the sky, cavalry thundered across the ridges, and the cries of Deus Vult and Allahu Akbar echoed across the battlefield. When the dust settled, the Christian coalition stood victorious. The chains that protected the caliph's guard, an unbreakable ring of warriors, had been shattered by the Navarrese king himself. It was said that the victory was so decisive that even the mountains trembled. Las Navas de Tolosa marked not only the beginning of the end for Muslim rule in Iberia, but also the awakening of a new confidence among the Christian kingdoms. From this moment onward, the Reconquista would move with relentless momentum. In the decades that followed, the Muslim South fractured once more. The Almohad Empire, once so powerful, crumbled under the weight of defeat and internal strife. City after city, Córdoba, Murcia, and Seville, would eventually fall, while Granada rose as the last glittering refuge of Al-Andalus. For the Christian kings, the dream of a united Iberia began to seem not only possible, but inevitable. Yet victory brought its own perils. Rivalries between the Christian crowns deepened. Castile and Aragon vied for supremacy. Portugal, newly independent, turned its eyes toward the Atlantic. The frontier lands, once ruled by swords and saints, became centers of wealth, culture, and trade. And beneath the surface of triumph, the fusion of Christian, they were the Catholic monarchs, determined to finish the Reconquista once and for all. Under their rule, Spain began to emerge, not yet in name, but in spirit. Their reign was guided by faith, strategy, and an unyielding belief that God had chosen them to complete the divine mission that had begun centuries before. Granada, though surrounded, did not fall easily. Its walls were strong, its people proud, its rulers desperate yet cunning. The last sultan, Boabdil, known to his people as Abu Abdullah, sought to hold the line against overwhelming odds. Between 1482 and 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella led an unrelenting campaign, city by city, fortress by fortress, tightening their grip around Granada like a closing fist. The war was as much psychological as military. The Catholic monarchs offered clemency to those who surrendered and fire to those who resisted. Their armies, disciplined and well-funded, marched under the cross and banner, their cannons echoing through the valleys. Inside Granada, famine and despair began to take root. Still, Boabdil wavered between pride and pragmatism, between his loyalty to his faith and the survival of his people. Finally, on January 2nd, 1492, the inevitable came to pass. Boabdil rode out through the city's gates to surrender the keys of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. Legend says that as he reached the mountain pass overlooking his lost city, he turned for one last look and wept. His mother, Aixa, is said to have whispered, "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." With that, 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Iberia came to an end. But the fall of Granada was not merely an end. It was the dawn of a new and complicated beginning. The triumph of the Catholic monarchs united Iberia under one Christian crown, but it also marked the birth of intolerance that would reshape its soul. Within months, the Spanish Inquisition intensified its grip, and the Edict of Expulsion forced the Jews, who had lived in Iberia for centuries, to convert or leave. The land that had once been a mosaic of faiths became a single color, washed in the zeal of religious unity. The fires of the Inquisition burned where lamps of learning had once shone, and the whispers of Arabic and Hebrew faded from the streets of Toledo, Córdoba, and Seville. Yet, even as one world ended, another began. That same year, 1492, Christopher Columbus, backed by Ferdinand and Isabella, set sail westward into an ocean still wrapped in myth. When he reached the shores of the Americas, he unknowingly began a new empire, one that would stretch across oceans, fueled by the same restless spirit that had carried Iberia through the centuries. The Reconquista had ended, but the conquista of the world had begun. Granada's fall was not only a military victory, it was the birth of Spain, a nation forged from faith and fire, from blood and beauty. Its cathedrals rose over former mosques, its palaces gleamed with both Christian and Islamic art, and its people carried within them the tangled inheritance of conquerors and conquered alike. The soul of Iberia, proud, tragic, radiant, had finally been bound into one crown, one cross, and one destiny. And so, beneath the crimson sunset of Granada, where the scent of orange blossoms drifts through the courtyards of the Alhambra, the echoes of history remain, the footsteps of kings and poets, of warriors and dreamers. The Iberian story had come full circle, from tribes and traders to an empire that would soon circle the world. The year was 1492, a hinge in human history. While the last banners of Granada were lowered, another flag was raised upon the deck of a small ship in Palos de la Frontera. It bore the red cross of Castile, and beneath it stood Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor with a dream as vast as the sea itself. With 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, he set out into the unknown, chasing a horizon few dared to follow. Behind him stood Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs who had conquered Granada. now eager to find new worlds to conquer not with armies, but with sails and stars. This was not just the beginning of exploration. It was the rebirth of Iberia's ancient spirit. The same curiosity that had once driven Iberian traders to meet the Phoenicians and Greeks now reached across oceans. The same courage that had led Celtiberian warriors against Rome now faced storms and uncharted waters. When Columbus reached the Caribbean, believing he had found Asia, the world expanded, and with it, the destiny of Iberia. Spain was no longer a fractured land of kingdoms and crusades. It was a rising empire. The unification of its crown, faith, and ambition had created a force the world had never seen before. Soon, conquistadors, part soldier, part adventurer, followed Columbus's path westward. Hernán Cortés to Mexico, Francisco Pizarro to Peru. Their swords, bearing the weight of centuries of reconquista, carved new empires from the jungles and mountains of the Americas. Gold flowed back across the Atlantic, filling the coffers of Castile and funding cathedrals that glittered under Spanish suns. But the conquest was not only one of steel, it was one of souls. Priests, friars, and missionaries accompanied the explorers, bearing crucifixes and Bibles instead of blades. The faith that had unified Iberia now sought to reshape continents. Entire civilizations, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, were caught in the storm of this new power. Some converted, some resisted, and many vanished. Yet in that collision of worlds, something new was born, a vast realm bound by language, faith, and empire. Spanish became the tongue of a hemisphere, its rhythm echoing the speech of Iberia's distant hills. Back home, Spain's cities transformed. Seville became the heart of transatlantic trade, its port crowded with galleons heavy with silver, cacao, and spices. Toledo, once the melting pot of three faiths, now forged steel and art for a new world order. Painters, poets, and scholars flourished under royal patronage. The Siglo de Oro, the Golden Century, began to dawn, an age when Spain's power seemed limitless, its influence stretching from the Philippines to the Andes. Yet even as Spain's empire reached across the seas, the memory of the old Iberia lingered like an ancient melody beneath the march of drums and the toll of church bells. The land had been shaped by countless hands, Iberian, Roman, Visigothic, Muslim, and though the kings of Castile now ruled from Madrid, the soil beneath their feet still carried the echoes of the past. The Alhambra still stood, shimmering with Arabic poetry. The hills of Numancia still whispered of defiance. The ruins of Tarraco still remembered the might of Rome. Spain's power, though vast, was not without burden. The wealth from the New World poured in faster than the empire could contain it, fueling both majesty and decay. The very gold that gilded its cathedrals would, in time, erode its strength. But for now, in this first great century after the fall of Granada, Spain was a blazing sun at its zenith. From the quiet villages of Castile to the silver mines of Potosi, from the cloisters of Salamanca to the palaces of Madrid, the spirit of Iberia, restless, proud, and eternal, had taken to the waves. The tribes who once traded amber and iron along the Ebro would never have imagined it. Their descendants now ruled empires across oceans, their flag flying in lands the ancients could not have dreamed existed. And as night fell upon the Atlantic, the same stars that once guided Iberian fishermen home now guided galleons bound for distant horizons, carrying not only gold and goods, but centuries of history, faith, and longing. The Iberian soul had become global, its fire carried in the lanterns of explorers who dared to follow the edge of the world. The 16th century unfolded like a tapestry woven with gold and blood. Across Europe, the name España was spoken with awe and fear. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Andes to Manila, the Spanish crown ruled over lands so vast that the sun itself never set upon them. It was an age of triumph, an empire forged by explorers, consecrated by faith, and immortalized in art and literature. Yet beneath that glittering surface, cracks began to form. Faint at first, but growing with every new conquest, every new coin of New World silver. The Iberian spirit, once divided among tribes, then tempered through centuries of struggle, now burned at its brightest. In the halls of El Escorial, King Philip II reigned with iron devotion. His empire stretched beyond imagination, yet his eyes often turned heavenward. Under his command, Spain became not merely a kingdom but the defender of Christendom itself. The Inquisition roared to life, its tribunals ensuring that faith and fear walked hand in hand. Across the seas, missionaries carried crosses into jungles and deserts, baptizing millions beneath the banner of empire. The Spanish sword was as much an instrument of religion as of war. But for all its austerity and orthodoxy, this was also an age of brilliance. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, a tale that laughed at the ghosts of chivalry even as it mourned them. Velázquez painted kings and commoners alike with divine realism. Cathedrals rose like mountains, filled with music that seemed to echo heaven itself. In Seville, the air was thick with the scent of oranges and incense. Gold glittered in church altars, and the hum of merchants mingled with the prayers of priests. This was the Siglo de Oro, the golden century, when Iberia, at last united and ascendant, became the cultural heart of the Western world. Yet empires, like men, are most fragile when they appear invincible. The rivers of gold that flowed from the Americas became a curse as much as a blessing. The more wealth poured in, the more Spain spent on wars, palaces, and the pursuit of divine destiny. Fields lay fallow while fortunes were wasted on distant campaigns. The Spanish Armada, a fleet meant to bring England to its knees, instead met ruin upon stormy seas. The crown's debt swelled, and beneath the gilded ceilings of Madrid, whispers began of overreach, of exhaustion, of decay hidden beneath splendor. Still, Spain endured. It ruled not only with armies, but with symbols, the cross, the crown, the language of Castile. Through its empire, the Iberian legacy spread like wildfire. Spanish words, faith, and architecture fused with native cultures across the Americas. Cities such as Lima, Mexico City, and Havana became reflections of Seville and Toledo, their plazas and cathedrals built in the Iberian image. Even in Asia, in faraway Manila, the echoes of Iberia resonated in the streets and songs of a new world that bore the mark of an old one. Back home, the Iberian Peninsula itself changed. The old kingdoms, Leon, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, now merged into one great identity. The last remnants of Al-Andalus faded, though its influence never truly died. Moorish art remained etched into the arches of Granada. Arabic melodies lingered in Spanish guitar. The very rhythm of the language, rolling, melodic, rich, carried centuries of cultural fusion within it. Spain was no longer a crossroads. It was the center of the world. But with the passing of time came fatigue. The empire that had stretched across oceans now strained beneath its own weight. Rival powers, England, France, the Netherlands, rose in defiance. Wars drained Spain's strength, rebellions shook its colonies, and the wealth of the New World began to dwindle. Still, in its heart, Iberia remained proud, the land of warriors and dreamers, saints and poets. The same fire that had burned in Celtiberian fortresses and Moorish palaces still flickered beneath the Spanish sun. For the Iberians, greatness had always come at a cost, and now, as the empire's gold gleamed brighter than ever, its foundations began to tremble. Yet in that moment, in the middle of the 16th century, Spain still stood as the greatest empire on earth, the living descendant of every people who had walked its soil, from the tribes who carved idols in the hills to the conquerors who crossed the seas. The dream of Iberia, born in the mists of prehistory, had conquered the world, and soon it would learn how fragile even the brightest dreams can be. The glittering empire that once ruled the oceans began to tremble beneath its own grandeur. By the dawn of the 17th century, Spain, the heart of Iberia's imperial dream, had become a paradox of splendor and decay. Its palaces gleamed with imported gold, Its churches overflowed with silver from the Americas, yet the soil beneath its own feet grew poor and exhausted. The wealth that had promised eternity now whispered ruin. For centuries, Iberia had fought, explored, and conquered in the name of faith and destiny. But now, the question began to rise like a ghost in the corridors of Madrid. What happens when an empire reaches the ends of the world, only to find that it has lost its soul along the way? The silver fleets that once dazzled the world became targets for pirates and rivals. English and Dutch ships, swift and ruthless, prowled the Atlantic and Caribbean, eager to bleed the empire dry. Trade routes faltered. Inflation soared. The Spanish crown, addicted to gold, borrowed endlessly, plunging the kingdom into cycles of debt it could never escape. The same oceans that had once carried Iberia's glory now carried its undoing. For every ship that returned laden with riches, another was lost to storms or war. The empire's own treasures became its curse, the very symbol of divine favor transformed into a burden too great to bear. At home, the people suffered in silence. Fields went untended as men marched to distant wars. Famine and plague stalked the countryside. The nobility clung to their privileges while the common folk bore the weight of empire. Cities that had once thrived on trade, Seville, Valencia, even Lisbon after the Iberian Union, began to fade into stagnation. The grandeur of Iberia's churches stood in cruel contrast to the hunger in its streets. Yet even amid hardship, pride endured. Spain remained a land of deep faith and defiant spirit. The same stubborn will that had built its empire now refused to admit its decline. Across Europe, the world shifted. New powers rose, France under the Bourbons, England with its fleets, the Dutch with their trade empires. Spain, once the master of the seas, now fought to hold its ground. The 80 Years' War had bled it dry. The 30 Years' War drained what little remained. The dream of a united Christendom under Iberian rule crumbled, replaced by the cold calculations of politics and survival. The Habsburg dynasty, once invincible, faltered beneath the weight of its ambitions. And as the centuries turned, Iberia's dominion, the first true global empire, began to shrink. Yet the decline of Spain was not a fall into darkness, but a transformation. In the twilight of empire, art and literature blossomed with haunting beauty. The painters Velázquez, Zurbarán, and Murillo captured both the majesty and melancholy of their time. Saints bathed in divine light, peasants cloaked in shadow. In their brushstrokes, one could see the very soul of Iberia, proud, wounded, unbroken. Writers like Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca filled the stage with heroes, dreamers, and fools, reflecting the contradictions of a nation that had reached heaven and found despair waiting there. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the colonies that had once filled Spain's coffers began to stir. Revolts, whispers of independence, and native resistance flickered like embers waiting for the wind. The same spirit of freedom that had once driven the Iberians themselves now burned in the here of those they ruled. The world was changing again, slowly, inexorably. The empire that had united continents would, in time, become the teacher of nations that would one day stand on their own. Through it all, Iberia remained a land of paradox. Even as it waned, it inspired awe. Even as its power faded, its culture deepened. Its songs carried sorrow and pride in equal measure. The voice of a people who had loved too fiercely, conquered too greatly, and believed too deeply. The Iberians had given the world maps, ships, and empires. But what they left behind was something far greater. The memory of human will stretch to its limits, the tale of how one small corner of the world once dreamed of holding all of it. And though the empires would crumble, though kings would fall and revolutions rise, the soul of Iberia, restless, golden, and eternal, would never die. It would live on in the languages of half the planet, in the music of the guitar, in the sunlit plazas of distant lands, and in the whispered prayers of those who still looked west toward the setting sun, where once the empire of Spain had burned like a star. As the 18th century unfolded, The Iberian Peninsula stood at a crossroads, weary from centuries of conquest, yet unwilling to relinquish its legacy. The sun that had once illuminated every ocean now seemed to waver behind distant clouds. Spain and Portugal, the twin pillars of the old maritime order, faced a new and uncertain age. Their fleets were smaller, their treasuries hollow, their colonies restless. Yet, within the fading light of empire, something profoundly human endured, the longing to hold on to greatness, even as time itself conspired to take it away. The Iberian crowns, once draped in divine right and oceanic supremacy, now found themselves buffeted by the winds of enlightenment and revolution. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, had torn the empire apart, pitting Europe's most powerful dynasties against one another. When the dust settled, Spain's glory had dimmed further. The Bourbons replaced the Habsburgs, bringing reform but also dependence on France. Portugal, too, clung to survival, tethered to its alliance with Britain. Across the seas, colonial governors and merchants sensed the fragility of Iberian authority. A new world was awakening, and it would not remain loyal for long. In the Americas, whispers of freedom began to ripple across mountains and jungles. Enlightenment ideals, liberty, equality, the rights of man, took root among Creole elites, scholars, and soldiers. The same routes once used for trade now carried ideas more potent than gold. From Simón Bolívar in the north to José de San Martín in the south, revolution spread like wildfire. One by one, Spain's colonies rose in defiance. The great viceroyalties of New Spain, Peru, and La Plata fractured into new republics. The dream of a universal Spanish realm crumbled into a constellation of nations, each speaking Spanish, yet each forging its own destiny. Portugal faced a similar reckoning. Its prized colony, Brazil, grew too vast, too rich, too self-sufficient to remain bound by Lisbon's control. When Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, the Portuguese royal family fled to Rio de Janeiro, transforming the colony into a royal court. By the time they returned, Brazil had become an empire in its own right, and soon after, in 1822, it declared independence under Dom Pedro I. Thus ended Portugal's greatest jewel, not in rebellion but in transformation. The Atlantic, once the lifeblood of Iberia's might, had become the stage of its quiet surrender. Yet decline does not always mean defeat. In the 19th century, Iberia discovered new forms of strength, not in conquest, but in culture. Painters, poets, and philosophers captured the sorrow and splendor of their fading empires. The Romantic movement, born from nostalgia and yearning, found fertile soil in Iberia's ruins. In Spain, Francisco Goya painted with a fury that bordered on prophecy, his brushstrokes revealing both the grandeur and the madness of empire. His Disasters of War laid bare the suffering of ordinary people, a haunting mirror of centuries of ambition. In Portugal, poets like Fernando Pessoa and later writers of the Saudade tradition transformed loss into art, a melancholic beauty that still lingers in the nation's soul. Meanwhile, at home, Iberia struggled with the ghosts of its own history. Civil wars erupted, the Carlist Wars in Spain, the liberal revolutions in Portugal, each echoing the deeper question, what does it mean to be Iberian when empire has faded? Cities modernized, railways crept across once remote valleys, and the church's iron grip loosened under the weight of reason and rebellion. Yet, for all the change, the rhythm of Iberia remained unmistakable. The toll of church bells at sunset, the hum of distant guitars, the solemn dignity of a people who had seen both the summit and the abyss of human ambition. By the late 19th century, the map of empire had shrunk to a few scattered dots: Cuba, the Philippines, Angola, Mozambique, and Timor. When Spain lost its last colonies to the United States in 1898, the world called it El Disaster, the disaster. But within Spain, a quiet transformation began. Writers like Unamuno, Machado, and Ortega y Gasset grappled with what it meant to lose the world and rediscover the self. The loss of empire forced Iberia to look inward, to its history, its faith, its enduring identity. Portugal, too, faced revolutions and the end of monarchy, emerging as a republic battered but breathing. Through it all, Iberia's greatest strength remained its ability to endure. Empires rise and fall, but cultures that can turn loss into poetry and pain into beauty never truly perish. The Iberians, descendants of conquerors and dreamers, carried within them the memory of oceans crossed and worlds discovered. Even stripped of empire, they possessed something no conqueror could take: the eternal pulse of their land, their language, and their longing. And as the 20th century dawned, the Iberian Peninsula, though humbled and fractured, stood as a living relic of humanity's oldest paradox, that greatness, even when lost, can still echo through time, like the sound of waves against the shore, whispering of what once was and what might yet be. The 20th century dawned quietly upon the Iberian Peninsula, yet beneath that calm shimmered the ghosts of centuries past. The grand empires of Spain and Portugal were gone, their ships long rotted in forgotten harbors, their colonies now independent nations scattered across the globe. But history, like the tide, never retreats completely, it only changes form. Iberia, stripped of its imperial splendor, began to search for meaning not on distant seas, but within its own fractured soul. Spain entered the century torn between progress and tradition, its people divided by ideology and faith. The monarchy, struggling to hold authority, faced unrest from workers, intellectuals, and regions yearning for autonomy. In 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed, a beacon of modern reform and fragile hope. But light in Iberia often came with fire. The country soon descended into one of the darkest chapters in its history, the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Brothers fought brothers, villages turned to ashes. The conflict was not merely political, it was existential, a battle between the old and the new, between faith and reason, between past and future. And when the guns fell silent, General Francisco Franco rose from the chaos, ruling with an iron fist for nearly 4 decades. His Spain was a land of silence and fear, where censorship shadowed every word, and the church regained its ancient power. Yet, even under oppression, the Iberian spirit could not be extinguished. Painters like Pablo Picasso defied tyranny with color and form, his masterpiece Guernica immortalizing the agony of war. Writers and poets whispered truth through allegory and memory, smuggling rebellion into verses that spoke of olive trees, broken wings, and the dignity of survival. Beneath the surface of dictatorship, the heart of Spain still beat, wounded but unbroken. Meanwhile, across the border, Portugal walked a parallel path. In 1926, a military coup ended the unstable First Republic, paving the way for Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's Estado Novo, a corporatist regime that wrapped nationalism in Catholicism and austerity. For decades, Portugal lived under the banner of discipline and duty, its people taught to obey and endure. But behind the facades of propaganda and empire, change was stirring. The colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau drained the nation's resources and spirit. Young soldiers returned home disillusioned, questioning why a small, poor nation still fought to keep distant colonies in an age of freedom. By the 1970s, the old order was cracking. The air of Lisbon grew heavy with whispers of revolt. On April 25, 1974, something extraordinary happened: the Carnation Revolution. Soldiers carrying red carnations in their rifles marched peacefully through the streets, overthrowing the dictatorship without bloodshed. The people filled the city squares, singing songs of liberation. Portugal, after half a century of silence, had found its voice again. The empire was officially dissolved, but the spirit of freedom had finally returned home. In Spain, too, the winds of change blew strong. When Franco died in 1975, the country stood at the edge of uncertainty. Yet, under King Juan Carlos I, Spain made a remarkable transition to democracy. The Constitution of 1978 established a new, modern Spain, a nation of autonomous regions, diverse voices, and renewed hope. The ghosts of civil war lingered, but they no longer ruled. For the first time in centuries, Iberia was not defined by conquest or submission, but by the quiet strength of rebuilding itself. As the 21st century unfolded, the Iberian Peninsula found itself standing between memory and modernity, a land reborn from its own ruins. The age of empires had long since faded, the sails of conquest furled and forgotten, but the heartbeat of the Iberians, ancient, resilient, and restless, still echoed through stone streets and salt-heavy winds. From the cliffs of Cabo de Roca to the sunburned plains of Andalusia, from the green hills of Galicia to the whitewashed villages of the Algarve, the story of Iberia continued, not as a tale of kings and conquerors, but as the quiet endurance of a people who refused to forget who they were. In Portugal, the sea still called to those who listened. Fishermen set out from coastal harbors as their ancestors had done for thousands of years, their boats painted with symbols older than Christianity. In the voice of Fado, that melancholy music born in Lisbon's taverns, one could still hear the ache of longing, saudade, a word that defies translation, a feeling that bridges love, loss, and eternity. It was the soul of Portugal distilled into song, the echo of sailors staring into the endless Atlantic, the sorrow of empires gone, the beauty of memories that refused to fade. The nation that once spanned continents had turned inward, but not in despair, in reflection. Its greatest discovery was not across oceans, but within itself. Across the border, Spain's rhythm pulsed with passion. In Andalusia, the flamenco dancer's heel struck the earth like a heartbeat, the guitar cried, and voices rose in ancient lament. In Catalonia, modernist dreams shaped the skyline. Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, a cathedral of stone still climbing toward heaven. In Basque country and Galicia, ancient languages survived, carrying whispers of pre-Roman Iberian tongues. And in Madrid, a city once built on imperial wealth, art flourished anew. Picasso, Dali, and Miro now hung in museums that drew pilgrims from around the world. The Iberians had always been wanderers, first traders, then explorers, and now, creators of culture that transcended borders. Their languages, Spanish and Portuguese, spoken by nearly 800 million people, became bridges across continents. From Buenos Aires to Rio de Janeiro, from Luanda to Manila, the Iberian soul stretched across the globe. In every accent, every rhythm, every borrowed word, there lived the echo of the old peninsula, the same stubborn spark that once burned in the hearts of warriors, sailors, and poets. Yet Iberia's story was not one of triumph alone. Its history had been carved by hardship, by civil wars, by dictatorships and dreams deferred. But that pain gave depth to its art and wisdom to its people. The Iberians learned, again and again, that greatness does not lie in domination, but in endurance. They had been conquered by Rome, ruled by Visigoths, transformed by Moors, and reborn through faith and fire. Yet through every storm, they had remained uniquely themselves. Their gift to the world was not empire or gold, but perspective, the knowledge that even the smallest nation can leave an infinite mark if it dares to dream beyond its shores. Today, as night falls over Iberia, the old and the new intertwine. Wind turbines spin where Roman watchtowers once stood. Highways follow the routes of ancient Roman roads. The same ports that once sent caravels to India can now launch satellites into orbit. The Iberians no longer look westward for new lands to conquer. They look upward, to the stars, where the next great journey begins. And perhaps, in some distant future, when humanity sails once more into the unknown, a quiet voice will whisper, in Portuguese or Spanish, words of courage once spoken on these coasts. Omar ao Kamiko de Tudo. The sea is the beginning of all things. The Iberians were never meant to fade into history. Their story is not a closed book, but a living current, one that flows through art, language, and memory. From the ancient tribes who carved idols into stone, to the sailors who mapped the world, to the dreamers of today who craft beauty from their past, the spirit endures. A spirit that understands that to be Iberian is to be both earth and ocean, both warrior and poet, both conqueror and philosopher. And so, as the waves break softly along the Iberian coast, the wind carries the scent of salt and time. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls from a stone church that has stood for 1,000 years. The sun sinks beneath the Atlantic, the same sun that guided explorers and watched over empires, and the world grows quiet again. Close your eyes now. The sea murmurs its ancient lullaby. You are standing where Europe ends and the endless begins, where the spirit of the Iberians still watches the horizon, waiting for the next dawn. Don't forget to subscribe, and let history carry you into dreams.